Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the quiet gardens of Heian, Japan, where moonlight drifts across still water and pavilions stand half open to the night air. Soft steps fall on wooden verandas, and the faint rustle of silk layers blends with the hush of distant flutes. Lanterns glow along the shoreline, their reflections trembling with each ripple. As courtiers gather in gentle silence, pages of poems lie ready, waiting for dew, mist, or crane wings to inspire a few delicate lines. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The Heian aristocrats of Japan were basically the original influencers. Except instead of selfies and hashtags, they had waka poems and painted fans, and instead of luxury cars or seaside villas, they obsessed over pavilions, garden retreats that sat by ponds, half open to the moonlight, perfectly designed for pretending you were having deep thoughts about a pine tree. The Heian period, lasting from 1794 to 1185, was one of those stretches of history where the people at the top seemed to live in a different universe entirely. While most of Japan's population was busy with little things like farming, paying taxes, or occasionally starving, the nobility in the capital of Heian, modern Kyoto, spent their days lounging around in pavilions. They weren't lazy, of course. Writing poetry about mist rising off water lilies at dawn is exhausting work. If you were an aristocrat in Heian, Japan, your house wasn't just a house. It was a stage set. The garden was part of it, designed like a dream of paradise. Ponds, streams, artificial islands, bridges that led nowhere but looked good doing it. Everything had to flow, to feel as if nature had been persuaded, not forced. The Heian elite liked things subtle, indirect, and a little melancholy. Nothing too straightforward, except maybe their gene pool, which got pretty narrow thanks to endless cousin marriages. A pavilion in one of these gardens was more than just a pretty structure. It was the center of aristocratic life. You could sit there with your lacquered writing box, brush poised, waiting for inspiration to hit. Maybe a crane landed nearby. Perfect. That's at least 3 lines of waka right there. Or you could drift onto a small boat in the pond, float under a bridge, and pretend you were in some half-imaginary landscape painting. And of course there was moon viewing, because nothing said elite leisure like sitting in expensive robes at night, gazing at the moon, and competing with your friends over who could write the saddest, prettiest poem about it. The Heian obsession with moonlight was almost a lifestyle. They had moon viewing parties, with people seated at intervals along verandas, listening to the sound of zithers and flutes carried across water. The point was to be moved, ideally not too much, though. The aesthetics favored a delicate sadness called mono no aware, which literally means the pathos of things. In other words, everything was beautiful because it didn't last, which was a nice idea, unless you were a Heian aristocrat who caught smallpox at 23. Then it got a little too real. Let's pause here and appreciate the sheer impracticality of it all. The robes, layers upon layers of them, each carefully color-coordinated to match the season. The gardens, perfectly tended, so that even the angle of falling leaves looked meaningful. The furniture, basically, floor cushions. And the occasional lacquered stand. Heian nobles didn't need comfort. They needed atmosphere. If you were uncomfortable, that just made your poem about dewdrops more authentic. And the poetry competitions. Oh, the poetry competitions. Imagine a bunch of very well-dressed introverts sitting around in silence, occasionally producing lines about autumn mist. Judges would then declare whose poem was superior, which meant someone had to have the official role of poetry judge. Yes, that was a real position. You could build a career not by fighting battles or running the treasury, but by having opinions about who captured the fleeting sadness of a riverbank most effectively. This wasn't just entertainment. It was politics. A good poem could get you noticed at court. A really bad one could sink you. Imagine your career riding on whether you correctly evoked the emotional resonance of a plum blossom. That was the Heian court for you. At the heart of all this aesthetic obsession was a sense of fragility. Heian aristocrats knew they were temporary. Their power rested on imperial favor and a bureaucratic system that could shift at any moment, so they invested in rituals that made life feel eternal. Moonlight, music, silk, incense, but always with an undertone of melancholy. And naturally, there were parties. Elegant, understated parties, but still, a pavilion by a pond wasn't complete without a gathering. Wine cups floated downstream in little boats, stopping in front of each guest, who had to drink, write a poem, and send the cup on. Think of it as the world's earliest version of a drinking game, except with more kimonos and less karaoke. The moon viewing nights could stretch on for hours. People would drift in and out of conversation. Someone would strum a koto, another would adjust their sleeves just so, making sure the layers caught the lamplight. Everything was a performance. Even boredom, looking wistful, was practically an art form. Of course, underneath all this refinement, life could be petty. Gossip traveled faster than incense smoke. If your poem wasn't up to standard, you could become the butt of jokes whispered behind fans. If your robes clashed with the season, people would notice. Even your handwriting was a matter of social survival. Calligraphy wasn't just about legibility, it was about emotional style. A heavy hand implied a coarse soul. A light, delicate brushstroke meant refinement. People judged each other's personalities by how their characters curled on the page. No pressure. But that was Heian life, a mix of beauty, anxiety, and absurdity, all staged in gardens where every stone and stream was a metaphor for something. The garden pavilion wasn't just a building, it was a mirror of an entire worldview. That the world was fleeting, that beauty was fragile, and that if you were going to waste your life, you might as well do it in 12 silk layers under the moon. Life in a Heian garden pavilion was not exactly fast-paced. No one was rushing around trying to be productive. Productivity, after all, was for peasants. Nobles at court preferred to spend hours, sometimes entire days, just arranging themselves and their surroundings to look appropriately poetic. The daily rhythm began, not with sunrise, but with the right combination of incense. A Heian aristocrat might wake up in their pavilion room, if room is even the right word, since most Heian mansions were a maze of curtains and screens instead of walls. Privacy was less about shutting a door and more about pulling a silk screen just far enough that people could only see your silhouette, which of course was considered very alluring. Nothing says romance like the faint outline of someone shifting behind a perfumed curtain. Perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a competitive sport. Nobles blended their own incense mixtures, carefully guarding recipes like they were state secrets. Imagine walking into a moon viewing party and someone immediately knows who you are just from the scent drifting off your sleeves. Ah yes, that's the man with the cedar and plum blend. Bold choice, maybe a little desperate. Clothing was even more elaborate. Court ladies in particular were weighed down. Literally, by the infamous Junihito, or 12-layer robe. In practice, it wasn't always 12. Sometimes it was more, sometimes less, but the principle was the same. Pile on as many beautifully coordinated silk layers as possible until you resembled a very expensive fabric cake. Walking wasn't really the goal. Gliding was, and if you fainted from heat exhaustion, at least you looked good doing it. Color combinations had to match the season. Wearing the wrong palette in the wrong month was a social disaster. Imagine showing up in spring colors in late summer. People would whisper, entire friendships could collapse. Color harmony was basically the Heian version of having good taste in memes. Without it, you were nothing. And then, of course, there was the hair. Long, floor-length hair. The Heian noble ideal was to let it flow, heavy and glossy, like an endlessly unrolled scroll. If your hair didn't trail dramatically behind you, were you even trying? Men were impressed less by your conversation and more by whether your hair caught the lamplight like polished ink. Again, exhausting. When all the perfumes, silks, and hair were properly arranged, then the actual day could begin, which mostly meant writing, exchanging letters, and occasionally showing your face to other human beings. Always from behind a screen, of course. The exchange of letters was almost erotic in itself. The paper had to be the right texture, the ink had to be mixed, just so, and the calligraphy had to float like clouds across the page. A smudge, a shaky line, that could end a romance before it began. Letters were sometimes scented too, so that even before you read the waka poem scrawled on it, you knew who it came from. Think of it as a medieval version of a scented text message, except each one took hours to compose and could determine your entire social ranking. And since we're talking about letters, let's not forget diaries. Many aristocratic women kept meticulous diaries, written not for themselves but for posterity, or more cynically, for everyone else at court to read eventually. Seisho Nyugon, lady-in-waiting to the empress, filled hers with lists of things she found charming, or annoying, or deeply disappointing. She's basically the original blogger. Meanwhile, Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji, which has been called the world's first novel, though really it's also a 1,000-page cautionary tale about dating emotionally unavailable aristocrats. And where were these letters, diaries, and poems written? In the pavilions, of course. By the ponds, under the eaves, next to the little bridges where carp swam listlessly. The whole point of the architecture was to provide endless excuses for beautiful writing. A sudden breeze through bamboo blinds, that's half a poem. The reflection of the moon in a rippling pond, that's the other half. Honestly, they made Instagram captions look like amateur hour. Meals were equally staged. The food itself could be simple: rice, fish, vegetables, but the way it was presented mattered. Lacquerware trays, elegant arrangement, delicate flavors. Eating was never just eating. It was another performance in the Pavilion theater, and if you had the right company, it could turn into a drinking and poetry marathon, with cups floating down streams or being passed from hand to hand until everyone was tipsy enough to think their verse about autumn dew was groundbreaking. Music floated in too. The koto, with its soft plucked strings, or the flute, airy and haunting. A few notes drifting across the water were enough to set the mood. People didn't dance or sing along. They just listened. Thoughtful silence was half the entertainment. All of this might sound refined, even boring, but beneath the calm surface, Heian court life was a shark tank of rivalries. Ladies in waiting competed for imperial attention. Men jockeyed for rank in the endless bureaucracy. Families intermarried strategically, producing children who were both future emperors and also disturbingly close cousins. The Fujiwara clan in particular perfected the art of marrying daughters to emperors, so that they could rule through their grandchildren. Subtle. No, effective. Very. And yet, in the middle of all these schemes, daily life in the pavilion still revolved around the same quiet rituals: incense, silk, poems, moonlight. Everyone was obsessed with appearances, but appearances were everything. A badly folded sleeve could ruin you. A misplaced sigh at the wrong time could send ripples through the court gossip network. If today's aristocrats worry about getting cancelled on Twitter, the Heian nobles worried about being remembered as the person whose seasonal robe colors clashed. The irony, of course, is that these people, so concerned with looking effortless and refined, were constantly exhausted by the effort. It was a full-time job to seem graceful. You weren't supposed to sweat, or hurry, or stumble. You were supposed to glide through life, trailing silk and sadness, leaving behind perfectly written poems and the faint scent of incense. And in the middle of all this theatrical refinement, the garden pavilion stood quietly, its wooden beams polished, its roof catching the sunlight, its verandas opening out over the pond. The pavilion was both a backdrop and a character itself, absorbing the laughter, whispers, and sighs of everyone who moved through it. It was the stage where Heian aristocrats lived out their endlessly choreographed lives, one perfumed letter and moonlit poem at a time. If you thought garden pavilions were just about writing poetry and gazing at the moon, well, you'd only be half right. The other half of pavilion life was about people, imperial figures, drifting through silk screens, whispering behind fans, and generally making a mess of things while pretending not to. Let's start at the top. The emperors. Heian emperors were supposed to embody divine authority, but in reality they were more like ornamental centerpieces. Their job was to sit still, look holy, and occasionally compose a passable waka poem. Real power often sat elsewhere, usually in the hands of the Fujiwara clan, those ever-persistent political in-laws who basically turned marrying into power into a generational sport. The typical Heian emperor spent his days in a haze of ritual, incense, and moonlight. He was dressed in layers of brocade so heavy that he might as well have been embalmed. Appearances at the pavilion pond were carefully staged, each bow and gesture choreographed for effect, and while he technically had wives and consorts, it was often his mother's relatives, the Fujiwara again, who decided what he ate for breakfast and whether he could sneeze in public. But don't feel too sorry for him. Even as a glorified puppet, the emperor lived in a dream world of gardens, music, and endless attention. And he still had access to more lovers, poems, and parties than most mortals could imagine. Of course, that didn't necessarily make him happy. Heian emperors were often pale, sickly, and exhausted by the very rituals that defined them. You could almost say their entire lives were carefully curated, like a painfully long aesthetic Instagram reel. Now, the empresses, Heian empress, were simultaneously adored and trapped. They were expected to be the embodiment of elegance, perfect robes, perfect calligraphy, perfect size at the moon. But they were also pawns in a larger dynastic chess game. If you were a Fujiwara daughter married to an emperor, congratulations, you were basically a political device wrapped in silk. Your main task was to produce a son, hopefully one that could be enthroned, thereby keeping your family at the center of power. This didn't mean empresses had no personality. Some of them wrote biting poetry, kept diaries full of scathing observations, and quietly ruled over their ladies-in-waiting with iron fans. Others simply faded into the background, remembered only as the mother of so-and-so emperor. Either way, they rarely escaped the suffocating circle of palace gossip. And then came the courtiers. This was where the real fun, or misery, happened. Court life was filled with ambitious men trying to rise through ranks that no one outside the capital even cared about. Minister of the left, minister of the right, poetry judge, keeper of the incense recipes. Every post mattered deeply within the palace walls, even if the farmers out in the provinces couldn't have cared less. Men at court competed not with swords but with poems. A clever metaphor about cherry blossoms could mean the difference between rising in rank or fading into obscurity. If you were especially talented, you might be invited to join an intimate moon viewing at a pavilion, where everyone pretended to admire your verses while quietly deciding if you were marriage material for their niece. And finally, the ladies-in-waiting. They were the real authors of Heian court life. Literally, many of them kept diaries, or wrote stories that survived to this day. These women lived in close quarters with empresses, shared their gossip, recorded their triumphs and meltdowns, and sometimes even had discreet romances of their own. They weren't free, exactly, but they were sharper observers than most of the men around them. Without them, we wouldn't know half of what we know about the Heian court. Take Sei Shonagon, for example, lady-in-waiting to Empress Teishi. She wrote the Pillow Book, a mix of diary, essays, and savage listicules about what she liked and didn't like. Charming things? The sound of a dog sniffing at someone's clothes. Annoying things? People who sniff too much. Disappointing things? A guest who shows up without properly color-coordinated robes. She's basically the Heian version of someone live tweeting their office job. Or Murasaki Shikibu, who served Empress Shoshi. She wrote The Tale of Genji, the sprawling story of a dreamy, melancholy prince who wandered through life seducing women, writing poems, and being emotionally unavailable to absolutely everyone. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Genji is supposed to be tragic or romantic, but anyone who's ever dated a flaky aristocrat knows it's definitely satire. All of this unfolded in and around the garden pavilions. These buildings weren't just pretty places by a pond. They were stages for whispered conversations, accidental glimpses, and deliberate displays. A man might approach a lady's pavilion at night, tapping discreetly on a screen to announce his presence. If she allowed him in, they might exchange poems, sigh meaningfully, and maybe scandal of scandals touch each other's sleeves. If she turned him away, he had to write a sad poem about rejection, because of course he did. The Heian court was, in short, one long, slow-motion soap opera. Everyone was always sighing, always writing, always performing refinement. And behind the beauty of the pavilions, there was constant maneuvering. Every look, every robe, every whispered word was part of the game. No wonder the gardens were designed for stillness, because inside the people were anything but. If there was ever a family that understood how to weaponize a silkscreen, it was the Fujiwara. For centuries, they perfected the art of ruling, without ever technically being in charge. The emperors might have been divine symbols floating gracefully in their pavilions, but the Fujiwara were the ones deciding which way the incense smoke drifted. Their strategy was both simple and exhausting. Marry daughters to emperors, then rule through the children born of those unions. Repeat, over and over, until you've wrapped the imperial family so tightly in your own bloodline that they can't breathe without asking your permission. It's the aristocratic version of if you can't beat them, breed them. Take Fujiwara no Michinaga, the poster child of Heian political maneuvering. He didn't just marry one daughter into the imperial line. He married 4. Imagine the family gatherings. Every imperial wife, every empress was his daughter. Every future emperor was his grandson. He basically turned the imperial palace into a Fujiwara daycare center. And through it all, he lived in luxury, drifting from pavilion to pavilion, hosting parties where poems and politics flowed in equal measure. Mishinaga was so confident in his dominance that he once wrote a smug little poem, comparing himself to the full moon, saying nothing in the world was lacking for him. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. If Heian Japan had Forbes lists, he would have been on the cover every year. The Fujiwara clan didn't need battlefields. Their battlegrounds were garden verandas, where whispered conversations decided the fate of emperors. They positioned themselves like shadows behind silk blinds, always present, rarely seen. And because Heian society adored subtlety, they excelled at pulling strings quietly, letting emperors keep their dignity while making sure no real decisions slipped out of Fujiwara hands. And yet, this power came wrapped in the same trappings as everything else in Heian life: poetry, robes, and garden rituals. Mishinaga himself loved the moonlit pavilion scene. He built sprawling estates, each with elegant gardens designed to impress both the gods and his political rivals. Imagine ponds so wide they required little boats, bridges carefully arched just for the aesthetic, and pavilions that seemed to hover over water. It wasn't just about beauty. It was about showing that he could bend nature itself into patterns of elegance. The Fujiwara loved to host moon viewing parties that doubled as strategy sessions. Everyone sat there, sipping sake, listening to koto music, pretending to be overwhelmed with melancholy at the sight of the moon. Meanwhile, behind the sighs and verses, alliances were forged, rivals sidelined, and future marriages arranged. The moon was just a witness to the endless flow of political maneuvering. But let's be clear, this wasn't a dynasty of warrior kings. The Fujiwara couldn't swing a sword to save their lives. Their enemies laughed at their lack of martial skills. They didn't need them. They ruled through marriages and court rich. If someone challenged them with armies, they usually found a way to marry into that family too. Subtle, sneaky, and silk-clad. That was their style. Of course, this led to some truly strange family trees. When everyone is marrying their cousins, uncles, and occasionally their nieces. Yes, that happened. The results get tangled. The imperial family became so interwoven with Fujiwara blood that you needed a diagram to figure out who was related to whom, which, in Heian Japan, was half the point. Confuse everyone else. Keep the power for yourself. And through it all, the pavilion life continued. Gardens echoed with the same quiet music, the same drifting cups of wine, the same poems about dew and blossoms. The Fujiwara may have been pulling every political string in sight, but they still had to perform the part of refined nobles sighing at the transience of things, while privately making sure nothing ever changed. Mishinaga himself died comfortably, still the power behind the throne, surrounded by wealth, family, and gardens that made the imperial palace look shabby by comparison. He left behind a court so thoroughly Fujiwaras that it would take generations for anyone else to claw back influence. For all their talk of impermanence and fleeting beauty, the Fujiwara were surprisingly permanent. So, the next time you picture a Heian pavilion glowing under the moon, don't just imagine a noblewoman writing poetry or an emperor gazing wistfully at the water. Imagine Mishinaga and his clan tucked just behind the curtains, making sure every sigh, every marriage, and every robe color ultimately served their dynasty. The moon may have belonged to everyone, but the court, that was Fujiwara property. If you ever wanted proof that Heian Japan was basically one long, slow-motion reality show, you don't need to look at the emperors or the Fujiwara. You just need to read what the women wrote down when no one was looking, or more accurately, when everyone was looking, because court diaries were less private journals and more circulated commentary. Let's start with Sei Shonagon, the queen of lists. She was a lady-in-waiting to Empress Teichi, and she wrote the Pillow Book, a mix of diary, observations, and sharp-tongued notes about what she found delightful or deeply irritating. Imagine someone scrolling through life, pausing to jot down things that make my heart beat faster, or things that are unspeakably boring. That was her entire aesthetic. Her lists are both charming and merciless. She adored the sound of dogs sniffing at clothes. She admired men who knew how to quote poetry at just the right time. She loathed people who sneezed too loudly or who wore out-of-season colors. She once mocked someone for failing to shut a screen door properly, apparently the medieval equivalent of leaving toilet paper stuck to your shoe. Reading her work feels oddly modern. You can practically hear her eye rolls through the pages. She was judgmental, witty, and unapologetically elite. And yes, she wrote much of it while lounging in garden pavilions, gazing at moonlight or cherry blossoms, with the occasional cup of sake in hand. Her words turn those pavilions from silent backdrops into buzzing theaters of whispered critique. Now contrast that with Murasaki Shikibu, another lady-in-waiting, this time to Empress Shoshi. If Sei Shonagon was the sharp-tongued blogger, Murasaki was the novelist who decided to go for broke. Her tale of Genji is sometimes called the world's first novel, though honestly it's also the world's longest cautionary tale about dating emotionally unstable aristocrats. The story follows Prince Genji, a handsome, melancholy, poetry-spouting aristocrat who drifts from romance to romance, leaving a trail of sighs and emotional wreckage behind him. He courts women behind screens, exchanges endless waka verses, and then inevitably grows bored, moving on to the next tragic figure. It's all very beautiful, very sad, and very repetitive, exactly like Heian life itself. Murasaki wasn't just writing fiction. She was holding up a mirror to her world. The endless moon-viewing parties, the obsession with robes and perfumes, the carefully staged affairs, all of it finds its way into Genji's wandering story. And beneath the surface, you can sense her quiet cynicism. For all the elegance, the Heian court was fragile, shallow, and painfully human. And then there are the other diaries, less famous, but equally revealing. Court women often kept journals of daily life, describing small moments in the pavilions, the way lamplight caught on painted screens, the awkward silence after a failed poem recital, the tears of an empress after another child was stillborn. These details cut through the stylized poetry to remind us that beneath the silk layers, people were exhausted, jealous, heartbroken, and often desperately bored. Imagine being confined to a life where the most exciting event of the week was whether or not the moon appeared from behind the clouds during your poetry contest. No wonder they wrote everything down. Gossip became literature. Shade became art, and through it all the garden pavilions acted as the perfect frame, a stage for elegance, but also a trap for anyone forced to perform refinement 24 hours a day. Sei Shonagon and Murasaki Shikibu themselves apparently didn't get along. In her diary, Murasaki sniped that Sei was flashy, shallow, and probably trying too hard, which is hilarious. because both of them were doing exactly the same thing, just in different genres. It's like watching two rival YouTubers shade each other for having the wrong editing style. Both brilliant, both irritable, both trapped in silk sleeves too heavy to move in. And the best part, these women's works outlived the pavilions themselves. The wooden halls rotted away. The gardens fell silent. The emperor's names blurred into obscurity. But the pillow book and Genji still exist. Their sarcasm and melancholy survived for 1,000 years, outlasting all the incense smoke and brocade. So when we picture those garden pavilions, at night, lamps glowing, poems drifting across the water, we shouldn't just imagine emperors and ministers. We should imagine women with ink-stained brushes, smirking behind their sleeves, quietly noting who looked ridiculous and who sighed at the wrong moment. Without them, we'd only have ruins. With them, we have the gossip, the snark, and the very human voice of Heian Japan. For all their silks, perfumes, and moonlit parties, Heian aristocrats were really just very fancy, sick people. Their lives were a theater of beauty, but the bodies beneath the robes often betrayed them. The air might have been perfumed with incense, but it was also thick with the coughs of tuberculosis, the fevers of smallpox, and the slow exhaustion of malnutrition disguised under layers of brocade. The Heian obsession with delicacy didn't help. Pale skin, thin frames, and languid movements were considered attractive, signs of refinement, which meant that half the symptoms of chronic illness were basically mistaken for good looks. If you were constantly tired, pale, and too weak to stand for long periods, congratulations, you were a style icon. The imperial children had it worst. Heirs were wrapped in brocade, shielded behind screens, and raised in rooms that rarely saw sunlight. Exposure to the outside world was considered dangerous, and to be fair, it was. But the result was a steady line of fragile heirs who struggled to survive into adulthood. Infant mortality was high, even among the wealthiest. The pavilions may have been designed to embody paradise, but they couldn't keep out smallpox. Every birth was a political event. If an empress or consort produced a son, her family's power skyrocketed. If the child died young, that same family might fall into disgrace. Imagine living in a world where your entire clan's fortunes depended on whether a 3-year-old survived the winter flu. No wonder the Fujiwara obsessed over keeping their daughters in the emperor's bedchambers. The future was always one fever away from collapse. And then there was the emperor himself. He was supposed to be divine, but he often looked more like a pale ghast, wrapped in layered robes. Heian emperors weren't known for their vigor. Many were short-lived, chronically ill, or simply too exhausted by endless rituals to maintain much of a presence. The Fujiwara didn't mind. A weak emperor was easier to control. Diseases left their mark on the court. Smallpox scarred faces, fevers left children stunted, and mysterious wasting illnesses thinned the already thin. People whispered about curses, angry spirits, or ill-omened comets. Exorcists and monks were summoned into pavilions to chant sutras through the night, their voices echoing against painted screens, incense smoke curling toward the rafters. Whether it worked or not is debatable, but it gave the illusion of control in a world where medicine was little more than prayers and hope. The irony is that while peasants outside the capital built strength in fields and villages, the nobles inside Hankyo were slowly suffocating in their own refinement. They prized stillness over activity, pale fragility over robust health. Exercise was unthinkable. Exposure to sunlight was vulgar. The most admired men and women were those who seemed always on the verge of fainting, sighing poetically about the moon. In other words, illness became fashion. And then there were the tragedies hidden behind the curtains. Court diaries tell of mothers weeping quietly as their children wasted away, of heirs celebrated one day and mourned the next, of elaborate rituals performed in garden pavilions to ward off spirits, while the real culprit, disease, slipped through anyway. Behind the perfect color-coordinated robes and perfumed sleeves, grief was a constant visitor. Even the literature of the time reflects this fragility. The tale of Genji is full of characters who sicken, fade, and die, their beauty only heightened by their early deaths. Melancholy wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a daily reality. Every poem about fleeting blossoms or vanishing dew was written by someone who had probably lost a child, a sibling, or a lover to one of the many illnesses that haunted the capital. And yet, court life carried on. Moon viewing parties continued. Poetry contests went on as scheduled. Robes were layered, incense blended, sleeves carefully arranged. Because in Heian, Japan, beauty wasn't a luxury, it was a form of survival. If everything was going to fade, you might as well write a good poem about it before you coughed yourself to death. So when we picture the garden pavilion lamps, glowing, music drifting across the pond, we should remember that behind the serene image, there was always a quiet undercurrent of fear. The sighs weren't just about fleeting blossoms. They were about fleeting lives, and the saddest part is that the Heian nobles knew it. They turned their own fragility into art, wrapping illness in silk, until it looked like elegance. If the Heian court looked serene from the outside, that was only because all the shouting was done in poetry. Behind the painted screens, life was one long competition. Jealous glances, petty rivalries, and rival clans waiting for each other to trip over their own silk sleeves. The garden pavilions, designed to embody calm beauty, were perfect stages for this theater of pettiness. You could sit in your pavilion, hair arranged like a black waterfall, and send out letters designed to charm one person while ruining another. Or you could casually sigh at the moon in a way that implied your rival wasn't nearly as sensitive as you were. Everything, every gesture, every fabric layer, every smirk was part of the game. One of the most common forms of rivalry was over clothing. Robes had to match the season, the occasion, and the mood. If someone showed up wearing a clashing color combination, it was open season for whispers. Wearing the wrong robe in the wrong month was like walking into a black tie gala in sweatpants. People would never forget. Then there were the rivalries over lovers. The emperor might have multiple consorts, but that didn't stop jealousy from simmering. One consort's poem might get more attention than another's. One lady in waiting might catch the emperor's eye during a moon viewing. Another might accidentally let her hair catch the lamplight in a way that made everyone else look drab. The results: whisper campaigns, subtle shade, and long nights of diary writing where grievances were carefully catalogued for posterity. Sei Shonagon, as we've seen, was ruthless in her observations, but she wasn't the only one. Other court women wrote entries that read like quiet daggers. It is unfortunate when a lady, though otherwise refined, laughs too loudly. Translation: she's common and should be ashamed. Or it is unseemly when a man recites poetry without proper feeling. Translation: his career is over. And sometimes the rivalries escalated. There are records of women intentionally releasing their perfume too strongly, just to overwhelm a rival's more subtle blend. Others would let their sleeves trail dramatically, blocking another woman's view of the emperor. Some even sabotaged letters, sending back facts that mocked the handwriting, the ink, or the choice of poem. Imagine receiving a text message where someone corrected your grammar, and then ghosted you. That was Heian rejection. The Fujiwara clan's dominance only fueled this environment when so much power hinged on which daughter produced which heir. The stakes of jealousy got higher. A single stillbirth could destroy a family's influence. A single surviving son could make another family untouchable. Every smile and sigh in the pavilion was measured against that backdrop. Even the poetry contests, which seem so harmless now, could become battlegrounds. A clever allusion might be read as a direct jab at a rival's failure. A judge's ruling might tilt in favor of one clan's supporter over another. Entire careers rose and fell on whether someone compared the right flower to the right season at the right time. It's almost funny, in a slow, tragic way. The Heian nobles lived in a world without battlefields, at least for them. Peasants and warriors fought and died elsewhere, but inside the capital, the wars were fought with robes, perfumes, and sighs, and yet the damage was real. Families rose and fell, reputations collapsed. Lives were marked forever by the failure to perform elegance in the right way. The garden pavilion, that quiet wooden structure by the pond, was not just a retreat, it was an arena. Every poem recited, every sleeve adjusted, every letter sent across the water was part of the competition. And in the stillness of the pavilion night, the faintest whisper could echo louder than any battle cry. What feels like an ending is often just a turning point. Shadows stretch forward, questions linger, and from the silence comes another voice, demanding to be heard. This is the hidden courtyards of Moorish Granada. Water, light, and echoes of paradise. The city of Granada rests quietly at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains in southern Spain. Though quiet is relative when you think about the many centuries of arguing, bargaining, and occasionally fighting that happened in its winding alleys. Still, the setting is calm enough to make you forget the drama, at least for a little while. Snow-capped peaks drift above, and the air carries the faint reminder that North Africa lies only a short sail across the sea. Granada, in its long Moorish age, became a place where gardens and courtyards were not just nice accessories, but essential elements of life. They were built as deliberate spaces where water, light, and sound all mingled to create what rulers wanted everyone to believe was a small slice of paradise. These courtyards were never random arrangements of stone and plants. Each was a carefully orchestrated stage. The walls would be coated with white plaster, catching sunlight and making shadows dance softly. Tiles in blues and greens suggested both sky and earth. And always there was water, flowing in narrow channels, spouting from carved lions' mouths, or resting in calm, reflecting pools. Water was the heartbeat of these hidden spaces. In a dry climate, simply displaying water in abundance was a statement of wealth and control. It also made the air cooler and the atmosphere more variable, a natural form of air conditioning centuries before electricity. The Moors, Muslims, who crossed into Iberia in the early 8th century, brought with them not only armies, but also traditions of architecture and gardening from across the Mediterranean and the Islamic world. By the time Granada rose to prominence, it was the last major Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. Its rulers, members of the Nasrid dynasty, knew their days might be numbered. Still, they left behind elaborate palaces, with courtyards that invite people to slow their step and listen for the echo of dripping fountains. You might imagine a ruler like Muhammad I, the founder of the Nasrid dynasty in the 13th century, pacing through these early palace gardens. He inherited a patchwork kingdom and decided that beauty and clever architecture would serve as a kind of political armor. If you cannot defeat your rivals outright, you can at least impress them into silence with carved stucco walls, polished tiles, and courtyards shimmering with pools of water. The idea was not only to inspire awe, but also to remind visitors that the ruler's authority was divinely sanctioned, linked to visions of paradise described in the Quran. The Court of the Lions, not far away, is even more famous. A central fountain rests on the backs of 12 carved lions, their faces stylized in a way that blends Islamic and earlier Mediterranean art traditions. Around the fountain, arcades form a cloister-like space where slender columns hold up light arches. Here, the play between water and stone feels theatrical. Sin channels lead away from the fountain in 4 directions, dividing the courtyard into quarters. Scholars often see this as a symbolic echo of the rivers of paradise, described as flowing with water, milk, wine, and honey. Whether or not visitors at the time made that exact connection, they surely understood that this was more than just a nice patio. It was an architectural metaphor made solid in stone and water. One of the best-known courtyards is the Court of the Myrtles inside the Alhambra, the great palace complex overlooking Granada. You can picture its long rectangular pool, bordered by clipped hedges of myrtle bushes, creating a flat mirror that doubles the arches and walls on either side. It's such a straightforward design, yet the effect is hypnotic. The stillness of the water invites you to stare, while the faint ripple of a breeze breaks the reflection, just enough to remind you that this is not an illusion, but a living space. These courtyards, hidden behind fortress walls, allowed the rulers of Granada to stage a daily performance of tranquility, even while political storms brewed outside. The Nasrid dynasty had to juggle alliances with powerful Christian kingdoms to the north, and occasionally send polite letters eastward to seek moral support from other Muslim rulers. Within these courtyards, though, the rulers could pretend their world was ordered and calm. Guests might be dazzled enough by the reflected light and the cool breezes that they forgot, for a moment, about the instability beyond the palace gates. The courtyards were also acoustically alive. Sounds carried differently here. The drip of a fountain seemed louder, amplified by stone walls. Footsteps softened when they crossed tiled floors. Conversations remained private, muffled by hedges and screens. Even the call to prayer, drifting faintly from a nearby minaret, could arrive filtered and softened. This layering of sound gave courtyards a dreamlike quality, where ordinary noises became part of a carefully tuned composition. It was not just royalty who found comfort in courtyards. The design spread to homes of the wealthy and even to more modest dwellings. A house in Granada, whether palatial or relatively simple, often revolved around a central patio. This was both practical and symbolic. Practical, because the patio provided light and air circulation, important in a climate with hot summers. Symbolic, because it created a private Eden, shielded from the bustle of the streets. Family life could unfold here, sheltered yet open to the sky. Over time, Granada became a hub where different traditions overlapped. Muslim artisans worked with Christian stonemasons and Jewish craftsmen. The courtyards absorbed influences from across the Mediterranean. Geometric tilework recalled designs from North Africa. Columns echoed Roman precedents. Gardens reflected Persian ideas of paradise as an enclosed, irrigated orchard. This blending was not accidental. It was the very definition of Granada as a crossroads city. The courtyards were like open books written in stone, water, and light, quietly telling visitors that here was a place where multiple worlds touched. The rulers themselves were not immune to the stresses of keeping up appearances. Muhammad Fihri, one of the most successful Nasrid kings in the 14th century, expanded and refined many of the courtyards at the Alhambra. He presided over a cultural flourishing, but even he had to flee at one point during palace intrigues, later returning to power. When he walked through the Court of the Lions, perhaps he drew strength from the orderly channels of water, pretending that his political life might be as balanced as the courtyard's design. In reality, the symmetry of the garden probably mocked him a little, whispering that human affairs were never so neat. Walking through these courtyards today, you might be tempted to think they were timeless, that they always existed in serene stillness. But the truth is that their tranquility was carefully managed. Servants cleaned the pools, clipped the hedges, and replaced cracked tiles. Builders repaired channels when water flows slowed. Everything depended on careful labor behind the scenes. Paradise, it turns out, requires maintenance. Granada's courtyards also carried subtle messages to visitors. Ambassadors from Christian kingdoms would be escorted into these spaces, shown the fountains and reflecting pools, and then politely reminded of the Nasrid ruler's sophistication. It was a kind of silent diplomacy, performed with stucco, stone, and myrtle bushes, instead of long speeches. If a visitor left dazzled, the courtyard had done its work. The decline of Moorish Granada did not erase its courtyards. When Ferdinand and Isabella conquered the city in 1492, they admired the beauty of the Alhambra and preserved much of it. They added their own touches. Of course, a large Renaissance palace was planted rather intrusively within the complex, but the original courtyards survived. Later travelers from Europe were enchanted. Poets and painters wrote about the Alhambra, sometimes exaggerating its romance, sometimes inventing tales of hidden treasures and ghostly rulers. The real courtyards, meanwhile, continued their patient work of cooling air and reflecting light, unbothered by the stories spun around them. The courtyards of Granada also linked the human and the cosmic. In Islamic thought, geometry is more than decoration. It suggests order, infinity, and divine unity. By walking through a courtyard with tiled patterns repeating endlessly, one was reminded of larger truths, even if only subconsciously. A pool reflecting the sky doubled this effect, joining earth and heaven in a single view. For rulers, this connection to the divine was politically useful. For visitors, it was quietly mesmerizing. The sensory experience of these places cannot be overstated. Imagine stepping into a courtyard after climbing hot, dusty streets. The temperature drops slightly as shade and water work their magic. The smell of myrtle and orange blossoms lingers. Sunlight reflects from the water's surface, rippling across carved walls. A fountain gurgles gently, steady and hypnotic. In that moment, you might almost forget the outer world. That was the point. Courtyards were not only architectural features, they were tools for shaping emotion. The story of these hidden courtyards is in some ways the story of Granada itself, a place of intersections, contrasts, and fragile beauty. Their survival allows us to glimpse a world that tried to imagine paradise on earth, not through grand monuments alone, but through carefully balanced spaces where one could sit, listen, and let the day drift by in watery reflections. Granada's courtyards remind us that architecture can be more than function. These were not just pretty gardens, they were symbols, metaphors, and tools of diplomacy. They were cooling systems and private sanctuaries. They were backdrops for politics and stages for quiet contemplation. In them, water became more than water, light more than light. The combination was subtle but powerful, and it still works centuries later. Over the centuries, the courtyards became subjects of restoration projects. sometimes careful, sometimes clumsy. Scholars debated whether to replant hedges exactly as they might have been, or to adapt them to modern needs. Tourists arrived, crowding spaces that were once hushed and private. Yet even in the bustle, the essential qualities remain. A ripple of water, a flicker of light, a faint echo under an arch. They still conspire to create an atmosphere that feels strangely outside of time. Step into a typical Nasrid-era house, and you would find it turned inward. Instead of large windows facing the street, there might be a simple doorway that opened into a quiet patio. Here, life unfolded. Children played, food was prepared, laundry was dried. A small fountain, even if modest, brought the sound of water into the heart of the home. Plants grew in pots or tiny beds, adding a splash of green to walls that otherwise gleamed in sun-bleached white. This design was not unique to Granada. It came from long traditions in Islamic architecture, which itself drew on Roman and Persian precedents. But in Granada, the effect felt especially pronounced, as though the entire city was a collection of hidden gardens stitched together by winding alleys. As we continue, the perspective drifts outward from these enclosed gardens toward the city that surrounded them, the streets and homes that echoed their designs in smaller, humbler ways, where narrow streets curled tightly together and whitewashed houses pressed against one another like sleepy neighbors trying to keep warm at night. Granada, during the height of its Moorish years, was more than the Alhambra Palace complex. It was a living city of artisans, scholars, merchants, and ordinary families, all navigating the daily rhythms of a society that prized both beauty and privacy. The courtyards of the Alhambra were dazzling, but they were also models that ordinary people imitated in smaller and more practical ways. Markets bustled with trade, and even in their chaos, one could find hidden courtyards, caravanserai, inns for merchants, often surrounded central patios where goods were unloaded and deals were struck. Imagine the clatter of hooves as mules entered, the shouts of traders in Arabic, Castilian, and Berber dialects, and the smell of spices mixing with livestock. Above the noise, a fountain still burbled away, trying gamely to impose a little calm on the marketplace. The contrast between noise and water was a theme running through Granada's life. The courtyards were places where sound was softened, where even a crowded inn might feel a touch gentler for the presence of a tiled basin and a small tree. Privacy was central. From the street, one could not easily see into the patio. This suited cultural values that emphasized the sanctity of family space. Yet privacy did not mean isolation. Neighbors could call over walls, and sound carried easily in the tight quarters of the Albaycin, the old Muslim quarter climbing up the hill opposite the Alhambra. The Albaycin was a maze of narrow lanes, designed less for traffic and more for defense and shade. Walking there even now, you notice how quickly sunlight and shadow trade places. A turn of the corner brings sudden coolness, then another corner, and you are back in blinding brightness. It was a city that made you feel sheltered, even as it kept you slightly off balance. The Albaycin held mosques, bathhouses, and markets. It was here that artisans produced the tiles, plasterwork, and carved wood that adorned the great palaces. Courtyards in these homes might be small, but they echoed the same principles. Light managed through lattice work, water flowing gently, and patterns of geometry repeating in floors and walls. Even the humblest home aimed to create an oasis, a retreat from the demands of the world outside. Religious life also shaped these spaces. Granada's mosques, like others across the Islamic world, often included courtyards with fountains for ritual ablutions before prayer. The Great Mosque of Granada, no longer standing in its original form, had such a courtyard. Worshippers would wash hands, feet, and faces at the fountains, surrounded by colonnades and open sky. Again, the combination of water, light, and space served both practical and symbolic purposes. The act of cleansing became part of a wider experience of stepping into a carefully framed environment, one designed to encourage calm focus. Granada's courtyards were not always about calm contemplation, though they could also host lively family gatherings, business negotiations, and even political plotting. The very privacy that protected families also gave cover for whispered plans. In an era of shifting alliances and uneasy truces, conversations carried out beneath orange trees and beside fountains may have changed the course of the city's history. It is almost amusing to imagine while rulers staged diplomacy in the grand courtyards of the Alhambra, local merchants might have been hatching schemes in their much smaller patios, both settings equally dependent on the soothing backdrop of running water. Education often happened in courtyard spaces as well. Madrasas, or schools, included central patios where students gathered to listen to teachers. In Granada, the Madrasa Yusufiyya, founded by Yusufiyya in the 14th century, stood as a prime example. Though parts of it were later converted under Christian rule, its courtyard reflected the same harmony of proportion and decoration found in the palaces. Students learning law, theology, and literature would have looked up from their books to see light dancing on water, geometry repeating in stucco, and perhaps felt, if only faintly, that knowledge itself was part of a larger pattern. Climate played a practical role in all of this. Granada's summers could be scorching, and courtyards worked as natural coolers. Shade from trees and awnings, evaporation from water, and airflow through narrow alleys combined to reduce heat. Before modern fans and air conditioners, this design was a matter of comfort and survival. At night, the courtyards offered open air where families could gather under the stars, cooler than sleeping indoors. In winter, when mountain air drifted down cold and sharp, the same walls that shaded in summer now shielded against biting winds. If the palatial courtyards of the Alhambra were showcases of luxury, the smaller courtyards of ordinary houses were reminders of resilience. They reflected a cultural insistence that beauty and practicality need not be opposite. A single tree, a clay jug of water, and a few tiles could create a sense of balance. Granada's inhabitants, whether royalty or artisans, understood that daily life needed oases of calm. The transition from Islamic to Christian rule did not erase these courtyards. After 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella claimed Granada, many Muslim houses were taken over by Christian settlers. The patios remained, sometimes altered, sometimes preserved. New churches rose where mosques once stood. But even some of these borrowed the courtyard form. Cloisters and monasteries echoed the same inward focus, the same relationship between water, light, and shade. The symbolism shifted, but the architecture proved too useful and too beautiful to abandon. Even today, walking through Granada, one finds hidden patios behind wooden doors. Some belong to private homes, others to inns or museums. The tradition of the enclosed courtyard has survived centuries of upheaval. The sound of water still drifts out through half-open gates, and glimpses of orange blossoms catch the eye. It is as though the city refuses to let go of the idea that paradise, however fragile, can be glimpsed in a small square of sky framed by walls. Because the Alhambra was never only a palace, nor only a fortress. It was both and more. Rising on its red hill above the city, its very name derived from Alhambra, meaning the red one, hinted at its commanding presence. The walls, built from reddish clay mixed with stone, glowed in sunlight and deepened in hue at dusk, as if the complex itself were shifting moods with the day. Within those walls lay a carefully curated world, where rulers could perform sovereignty and courtyards were the main stage sets. As the narrative drifts further, attention turns from the daily life of Granada's courtyards to the wider role of the Alhambra itself, the monumental complex where architecture, politics, and illusion blended into something unforgettable. The Alhambra's construction stretched across generations, beginning in earnest with Muhammad I in the mid-13th century, and evolving under his successors. Each ruler left a mark, but always within the same general vision, a self-contained city of palaces, administrative buildings, barracks, and gardens, with courtyards binding them together. The effect was theatrical. Every visitor entered a sequence of spaces that unfolded deliberately, like acts in a slow play. You might begin in an outer courtyard with soldiers milling about, then move into a reception hall where fountains murmured, before finally being led into an inner chamber of dazzling stucco and filtered light. The transition from harsh exterior to tranquil interior was itself part of the message. The Court of the Lions, built under Muhammad V, played a different role. It was part of a residential palace, more intimate, though still grand. Here, the 12 carved lions supporting the fountain formed a circle of guardians. Their stylized features suggested power, but also a curious blending of cultures. Lion imagery was common in earlier Jewish and Christian art, and its presence in the heart of the Alhambra hinted at Granada's mixed influences. Water flowing from the lions into 4 channels divided the courtyard like a cosmic diagram, reminding all who entered that even leisure could be wrapped in symbolism. For the Sultan, walking among these fountains was both recreation and political theatre. His very presence in such a space suggested divine alignment. Consider the Camara's Palace, with its famous Hall of the Ambassadors. This was the throne room of the Nasrid rulers, and its approach was through the court of the Myrtles. That courtyard, with its long reflecting pool, was not just decoration but prelude. As visitors walked past the still water, they were guided toward the audience hall, their eyes adjusted to brightness reflecting from the pool, their ears tuned to the quiet splash of fountains, so that by the time they entered the grand chamber, they were already softened, half hypnotized. The ruler seated on his throne, surrounded by inscriptions praising divine authority, seemed more than a man. He seemed the inevitable center of a harmonious universe. What feels like an ending is often just a turning point. Shadows stretch forward, questions linger, and from the silence comes another voice, demanding to be heard. This is the hidden courtyards of Moorish Granada. Water, light, and echoes of paradise. The city of Granada rests quietly at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains in southern Spain. Though quiet is relative when you think about the many centuries of arguing, bargaining, and occasionally fighting that happened in its winding alleys. Still, the setting is calm enough to make you forget the drama, at least for a little while. Snow-capped peaks drift above, and the air carries the faint reminder that North Africa lies only a short sail across the sea. Granada, in its long Moorish age, became a place where gardens and courtyards were not just nice accessories, but essential elements of life. They were built as deliberate spaces where water, light, and sound all mingled to create what rulers wanted everyone to believe was a small slice of paradise. The Moors, Muslims, who crossed into Iberia in the early 8th century, brought with them not only armies, but also traditions of architecture and gardening from across the Mediterranean and the Islamic world. By the time Granada rose to prominence, it was the last major Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. Its rulers, members of the Nasrid dynasty, knew their days might be numbered. Still, they left behind elaborate palaces with courtyards that invite people to slow their step and listen for the echo of dripping fountains. You might imagine a ruler like Muhammad I, the founder of the Nasrid dynasty in the 13th century, pacing through these early palace gardens. He inherited a patchwork kingdom and decided that beauty and clever architecture would serve as a kind of political armor. If you cannot defeat your rivals outright, you can at least impress them into silence with carved stucco walls, polished tiles, and courtyards shimmering with pools of water. The idea was not only to inspire awe, but also to remind visitors that the ruler's authority was divinely sanctioned, linked to visions of paradise described in the Quran. These courtyards were never random arrangements of stone and plants. Each was a carefully orchestrated stage. The walls would be coated with white plaster, catching sunlight and making shadows dance softly. Tiles in blues and greens suggested both sky and earth. And always there was water, flowing in narrow channels, spouting from carved lions' mouths, or resting in calm, reflecting pools. Water was the heartbeat of these hidden spaces. In a dry climate, simply displaying water in abundance was a statement of wealth and control. It also made the air cooler and the atmosphere more variable, a natural form of air conditioning centuries before electricity. One of the best-known courtyards is the Court of the Myrtles inside the Alhambra, the great palace complex overlooking Granada. You can picture its long rectangular pool, bordered by clipped hedges of myrtle bushes, creating a flat mirror that doubles the arches and walls on either side. It's such a straightforward design, yet the effect is hypnotic. The stillness of the water invites you to stare, while the faint ripple of a breeze breaks the reflection, just enough to remind you that this is not an illusion, but a living space. The Court of the Lions, not far away, is even more famous. A central fountain rests on the backs of 12 carved lions, their faces stylized in a way that blends Islamic and earlier Mediterranean art traditions. Around the fountain, arcades form a cloister-like space where slender columns hold up light arches. Here, the play between water and stone feels theatrical. Sin channels lead away from the fountain in 4 directions, dividing the courtyard into quarters. Scholars often see this as a symbolic echo of the rivers of paradise, described as flowing with water, milk, wine, and honey. Whether or not visitors at the time made that exact connection, they surely understood that this was more than just a nice patio. It was an architectural metaphor made solid in stone and water. These courtyards, hidden behind fortress walls, allowed the rulers of Granada to stage a daily performance of tranquility, even while political storms brewed outside. The Nasrid dynasty had to juggle alliances with powerful Christian kingdoms to the north, and occasionally send polite letters eastward to seek moral support from other Muslim rulers. Within these courtyards, though, the rulers could pretend their world was ordered and calm. Guests might be dazzled enough by the reflected light and the cool breezes that they forgot, for a moment, about the instability beyond the palace gates. It was not just royalty who found comfort in courtyards. The design spread to homes of the wealthy and even to more modest dwellings. A house in Granada, whether palatial or relatively simple, often revolved around a central patio. This was both practical and symbolic. Practical, because the patio provided light and air circulation, important in a climate with hot summers. Symbolic, because it created a private Eden, shielded from the bustle of the streets. Family life could unfold here, sheltered yet open to the sky. The courtyards were also acoustically alive. Sounds carried differently here. The drip of a fountain seemed louder, amplified by stone walls. Footsteps softened when they crossed tiled floors. Conversations remained private, muffled by hedges and screens. Even the call to prayer, drifting faintly from a nearby minaret, could arrive filtered and softened. This layering of sound gave courtyards a dreamlike quality, where ordinary noises became part of a carefully tuned composition. Over time, Granada became a hub where different traditions overlapped. Muslim artisans worked with Christian stonemasons and Jewish craftsmen. The courtyards absorbed influences from across the Mediterranean. Geometric tilework recalled designs from North Africa. Columns echoed Roman precedents. Gardens reflected Persian ideas of paradise as an enclosed, irrigated orchard. This blending was not accidental. It was the very definition of Granada as a crossroads city. The courtyards were like open books written in stone, water, and light, quietly telling visitors that here was a place where multiple worlds touched. Walking through these courtyards today, you might be tempted to think they were timeless, that they always existed in serene stillness. But the truth is that their tranquility was carefully managed. Servants cleaned the pools, clipped the hedges, and replaced cracked tiles. Builders repaired channels when water flows slowed. Everything depended on careful labor behind the scenes. Paradise, it turns out, requires maintenance. The rulers themselves were not immune to the stresses of keeping up appearances. Muhammad Fihri, one of the most successful Nasrid kings in the 14th century, expanded and refined many of the courtyards at the Alhambra. He presided over a cultural flourishing, but even he had to flee at one point during palace intrigues, later returning to power. When he walked through the Court of the Lions, perhaps he drew strength from the orderly channels of water, pretending that his political life might be as balanced as the courtyard's design. In reality, the symmetry of the garden probably mocked him a little, whispering that human affairs were never so neat. Granada's courtyards also carried subtle messages to visitors. Ambassadors from Christian kingdoms would be escorted into these spaces, shown the fountains and reflecting pools, and then politely reminded of the Nasrid ruler's sophistication. It was a kind of silent diplomacy, performed with stucco, stone, and myrtle bushes, instead of long speeches. If a visitor left dazzled, the courtyard had done its work. The sensory experience of these places cannot be overstated. Imagine stepping into a courtyard after climbing hot, dusty streets. The temperature drops slightly as shade and water work their magic. The smell of myrtle and orange blossoms lingers. Sunlight reflects from the water's surface, rippling across carved walls. A fountain gurgles gently, steady and hypnotic. In that moment, you might almost forget the outer world. That was the point. Courtyards were not only architectural features, they were tools for shaping emotion. The courtyards of Granada also linked the human and the cosmic. In Islamic thought, geometry is more than decoration. It suggests order, infinity, and divine unity. By walking through a courtyard with tiled patterns repeating endlessly, one was reminded of larger truths, even if only subconsciously. A pool reflecting the sky doubled this effect, joining earth and heaven in a single view. For rulers, this connection to the divine was politically useful. For visitors, it was quietly mesmerizing. The decline of Moorish Granada did not erase its courtyards. When Ferdinand and Isabella conquered the city in 1492, they admired the beauty of the Alhambra and preserved much of it. They added their own touches, Of course, a large Renaissance palace was planted rather intrusively within the complex, but the original courtyards survived. Later travelers from Europe were enchanted. Poets and painters wrote about the Alhambra, sometimes exaggerating its romance, sometimes inventing tales of hidden treasures and ghostly rulers. The real courtyards, meanwhile, continued their patient work of cooling air and reflecting light, unbothered by the stories spun around them. Over the centuries, the courtyards became subjects of restoration projects, sometimes careful, sometimes clumsy. Scholars debated whether to replant hedges exactly as they might have been, or to adapt them to modern needs. Tourists arrived, crowding spaces that were once hushed and private. Yet even in the bustle, the essential qualities remain. A ripple of water, a flicker of light, a faint echo under an arch. They still conspire to create an atmosphere that feels strangely outside of time. Granada's courtyards remind us that architecture can be more than function. These were not just pretty gardens, they were symbols, metaphors, and tools of diplomacy. They were cooling systems and private sanctuaries. They were backdrops for politics and stages for quiet contemplation. In them, water became more than water, light more than light. The combination was subtle but powerful, and it still works centuries later. The story of these hidden courtyards is in some ways the story of Granada itself, a place of intersections, contrasts, and fragile beauty. Their survival allows us to glimpse a world that tried to imagine paradise on earth, not through grand monuments alone, but through carefully balanced spaces where one could sit, listen, and let the day drift by in watery reflection. As we continue, the perspective drifts outward from these enclosed gardens toward the city that surrounded them, the streets and homes that echoed their designs in smaller, humbler ways, where narrow streets curled tightly together and whitewashed houses pressed against one another like sleepy neighbors trying to keep warm at night. Granada, during the height of its Moorish years, was more than the Alhambra Palace complex. It was a living city of artisans, scholars, merchants, and ordinary families, all navigating the daily rhythms of a society that prized both beauty and privacy. The courtyards of the Alhambra were dazzling, but they were also models that ordinary people imitated in smaller and more practical ways. Step into a typical Nasrid-era house, and you would find it turned inward. Instead of large windows facing the street, there might be a simple doorway that opened into a quiet patio. Here, life unfolded. Children played, food was prepared, laundry was dried. A small fountain, even if modest, brought the sound of water into the heart of the home. Plants grew in pots or tiny beds, adding a splash of green to walls that otherwise gleamed in sun-bleached white. This design was not unique to Granada. It came from long traditions in Islamic architecture, which itself drew on Roman and Persian precedents. But in Granada, the effect felt especially pronounced, as though the entire city was a collection of hidden gardens stitched together by winding alleys. Privacy was central. From the street, one could not easily see into the patio. This suited cultural values that emphasized the sanctity of family space. Yet privacy did not mean isolation. Neighbors could call over walls, and sound carried easily in the tight quarters of the Albaycin, the old Muslim quarter climbing up the hill opposite the Alhambra. The Albaycin was a maze of narrow lanes, designed less for traffic and more for defense and shade. Walking there even now, you notice how quickly sunlight and shadow trade places. A turn of the corner brings sudden coolness, then another corner, and you are back in blinding brightness. It was a city that made you feel sheltered, even as it kept you slightly off balance. The Albayacine held mosques, bathhouses, and markets. It was here that artisans produced the tiles, plasterwork, and carved wood that adorned the great palaces. Courtyards in these homes might be small, but they echoed the same principles: light managed through lattice work, water flowing gently, and patterns of geometry repeating in floors and walls. Even the humblest home aimed to create an oasis, a retreat from the demands of the world outside. Markets bustled with trade, and even in their chaos, one could find hidden courtyards, caravanserai, inns for merchants, often surrounded central patios where goods were unloaded and deals were struck. Imagine the clatter of hooves as mules entered, the shouts of traders in Arabic, Castilian, and Berber dialects, and the smell of spices mixing with livestock. Above the noise, a fountain still burbled away, trying gamely to impose a little calm on the marketplace. The contrast between noise and water was a theme running through Granada's life. The courtyards were places where sound was softened, where even a crowded inn might feel a touch gentler for the presence of a tiled basin and a small tree. Religious life also shaped these spaces. Granada's mosques, like others across the Islamic world, often included courtyards with fountains for ritual ablutions before prayer. The Great Mosque of Granada, no longer standing in its original form, had such a courtyard. Worshippers would wash hands, feet, and faces at the fountains, surrounded by colonnades and open sky. Again, the combination of water, light, and space served both practical and symbolic purposes. The act of cleansing became part of a wider experience of stepping into a carefully framed environment, one designed to encourage calm focus. Education often happened in courtyard spaces as well. Madrasas, or schools, included central patios where students gathered to listen to teachers. In Granada, the Madrasa Yusufiyya, founded by Yusufiyya in the 14th century, stood as a prime example. Though parts of it were later converted under Christian rule, its courtyard reflected the same harmony of proportion and decoration found in the palaces. Students learning law, theology, and literature would have looked up from their books to see light dancing on water, geometry repeating in stucco, and perhaps felt, if only faintly, that knowledge itself was part of a larger pattern. Granada's courtyards were not always about calm contemplation, though they could also host lively family gatherings, business negotiations, and even political plotting. The very privacy that protected families also gave cover for whispered plans. In an era of shifting alliances and uneasy truces, conversations carried out beneath orange trees and beside fountains may have changed the course of the city's history. It is almost amusing to imagine while rulers staged diplomacy in the grand courtyards of the Alhambra, local merchants might have been hatching schemes in their much smaller patios, both settings equally dependent on the soothing backdrop of running water. Climate played a practical role in all of this. Granada's summers could be scorching, and courtyards worked as natural coolers. Shade from trees and awnings, evaporation from water, and airflow through narrow alleys combined to reduce heat. Before modern fans and air conditioners, this design was a matter of comfort and survival. At night, the courtyards offered open air where families could gather under the stars, cooler than sleeping indoors. In winter, when mountain air drifted down cold and sharp, the same walls that shaded in summer now shielded against biting winds. If the palatial courtyards of the Alhambra were showcases of luxury, the smaller courtyards of ordinary houses were reminders of resilience. They reflected a cultural insistence that beauty and practicality need not be opposite. A single tree, a clay jug of water, and a few tiles could create a sense of balance. Granada's inhabitants, whether royalty or artisans, understood that daily life needed oases of calm. The transition from Islamic to Christian rule did not erase these courtyards. After 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella claimed Granada, many Muslim houses were taken over by Christian settlers. The patios remained, sometimes altered, sometimes preserved. New churches rose where mosques once stood, but even some of these borrowed the courtyard form. Cloisters and monasteries echoed the same inward focus, the same relationship between water, light, and shade. The symbolism shifted, but the architecture proved too useful and too beautiful to abandon. Even today, walking through Granada, one finds hidden patios behind wooden doors. Some belong to private homes, others to inns or museums. The tradition of the enclosed courtyard has survived centuries of upheaval. The sound of water still drifts out through half-open gates, and glimpses of orange blossoms catch the eye. It is as though the city refuses to let go of the idea that paradise, however fragile, can be glimpsed in a small square of sky framed by walls. As the narrative drifts further, attention turns from the daily life of Granada's courtyards to the wider role of the Alhambra itself, the monumental complex where architecture, politics, and illusion blended into something unforgettable. Because the Alhambra was never only a palace, nor only a fortress. It was both and more. Rising on its red hill above the city, its very name derived from Alhambra, meaning the red one, hinted at its commanding presence. The walls, built from reddish clay mixed with stone, glowed in sunlight and deepened in hue at dusk, as if the complex itself were shifting moods with the day. Within those walls lay a carefully curated world, where rulers could perform sovereignty and courtyards were the main stage set. The Alhambra's construction stretched across generations, beginning in earnest with Muhammad I in the mid-13th century, and evolving under his successors. Each ruler left a mark, but always within the same general vision, a self-contained city of palaces, administrative buildings, barracks, and gardens, with courtyards binding them together. The effect was theatrical. Every visitor entered a sequence of spaces that unfolded deliberately, like acts in a slow play. You might begin in an outer courtyard with soldiers milling about, then move into a reception hall where fountains murmured, before finally being led into an inner chamber of dazzling stucco and filtered light. The transition from harsh exterior to tranquil interior was itself part of the message. Consider the Camara's Palace, with its famous Hall of the Ambassadors. This was the throne room of the Nasrid rulers, and its approach was through the court of the Myrtles. That courtyard, with its long reflecting pool, was not just decoration but prelude. As visitors walked past the still water, they were guided toward the audience hall, their eyes adjusted to brightness, reflecting from the pool, their ears tuned to quiet splash of fountains, so that by the time they entered the grand chamber, they were already softened, half hypnotized. The ruler seated on his throne, surrounded by inscriptions praising divine authority, seemed more than a man. He seemed the inevitable center of a harmonious universe. The Court of the Lions, built under Muhammad V, played a different role. It was part of a residential palace, more intimate, though still grand. Here, the 12 carved lions supporting the fountain formed a circle of guardians. Their stylized features suggested power, but also a curious blending of cultures. Lion imagery was common in earlier Jewish and Christian art, and its presence in the heart of the Alhambra hinted at Granada's mixed influences. Water flowing from the lions into 4 channels divided the courtyard like a cosmic diagram, reminding all who entered that even leisure could be wrapped in symbolism. For the Sultan, walking among these fountains was both recreation and political theatre. His very presence in such a space suggested divine alignment. Light itself was part of the performance. Openings in the walls and ceilings were carefully arranged to create shifting effects. Sunlight might spill into a hall in the morning, then retreat to cast patterned shadows by afternoon. Stucco walls carved with intricate lattice work caught the light in ways that made solid stone seem delicate, almost like lace. By evening, oil lamps took over, their flickering reflections on water giving the illusion of stars shimmering within earthly walls. Every hour of the day became another act in the play of sovereignty. The Alhambra was also an archive in stone and plaster. Its walls carried inscriptions, verses from the Quran, poems praising rulers, reminders of paradise. Some inscriptions were large and bold, others subtle, tucked into repeating patterns so that they seemed whispered rather than announced. Together, they created a layered text that visitors could literally walk through, reading, or at least noticing these words while surrounded by echoing water and filtered light, made the political point without needing long speeches. The Nasrid rulers were not just kings, but caretakers of a divinely ordained order. Of course, behind the stagecraft, there were practical needs. The Alhambra had to function as a fortress as well as a palace. Its towers looked out over Granada and the surrounding plains, ready to spot danger. Soldiers garrisoned within the walls were less impressed by fountains and more concerned with defending gates. Yet even here, courtyards appeared. The Alhazaba, the military section, included open spaces where troops could gather. The rhythm of water and stone did not belong only to royalty. It extended into the routines of defense, though admittedly in plainer form. The Alhambra was also a city unto itself, with streets, workshops, and even a hammam, or bathhouse. The bathhouse, naturally, revolved around courtyards. Washing and relaxation took place under domed ceilings pierced with star-shaped skylights where light filtered in softly. Here, as in the palaces, the goal was transformation. One entered, burdened by the world, passed through water and patterned light, and emerged renewed. Visitors often commented on the dreamlike quality of the Alhambra. Christian envoys, when admitted, could not help but be impressed, even if they pretended otherwise in their reports. Later, when the city fell to Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquerors themselves were careful to preserve much of the complex. Perhaps they too recognized that the Alhambra was not simply a trophy but a setting whose courtyards held something beyond political value, an atmosphere that lingered and worked subtly on anyone who entered. And yet, the Alhambra was not invulnerable. Political intrigues seeped through its walls. Sultan after sultan faced rebellion, exile, or assassination. Brothers turned against brothers, and heirs were imprisoned or blinded. The courtyards, designed to suggest eternal harmony, became stages for human discord. Imagine whispers echoing beneath the arches of the Court of the Lions, not of poetry, but of plots. The fountains gurgled on, indifferent to betrayal. In this contrast, the courtyards became almost ironic. Eternal paradises in which very temporary rulers tried to maintain control. The role of women in these spaces, though less recorded, was also significant. The harem quarters of the Alhambra, with their own smaller courtyards, were places of domestic life, family politics, and quiet power. Water still flowed, light still played, but the audience here was more private. Women of the Nasrid dynasty lived in these spaces, influencing succession and politics from behind screens and through whispered conversations. Their courtyards were less public, but no less symbolic, offering sanctuaries where the dramas of domestic survival unfolded on a quieter stage. If you pause to think of the Alhambra as theatre, its courtyards were both scenery and actors. They framed the ruler's presence, but they also spoke on their own, with water as voice and light as expression. The play was continuous, repeating every day, every season, with the same cues but different audiences. Some understood the symbolism, others simply enjoyed the coolness. Either way, the courtyards performed their role faithfully, outlasting the rulers they once glorified. The Alhambra's courtyards eventually became legends in themselves. When the dynasty fell and the Christian monarchs took over, travelers began to tell stories of enchanted palaces, lost jewels, and ghostly rulers haunting the fountains. Later, poets and painters romanticized these spaces, often ignoring their original context. The courtyards, patient as always, accepted these new roles too, becoming muses for artists who had never known the Nasrid kings. What makes the Alhambra's courtyards so enduring is that they balance contradictions. They are both open and enclosed, both functional and symbolic, both serene and ironic. They invite reflection while reminding us of impermanence. To walk through them is to drift between worlds, never quite settling, always half aware that the paradise they suggest is both present and slipping away. From here, the focus lies to the role of water itself, not just as decoration but as lifeblood of the entire complex, carried by ingenious channels and aqueducts that turned an arid hill into a shimmering stage of fountains and pools. The Alhambra, for all its dazzling stucco and poetic inscriptions, would have been nothing without its water. In a climate where summers burned hot and rain was scarce, water was not simply a luxury, it was survival. To display it in abundance, in fountains and pools that never seemed to dry, was both a technical achievement and a statement of power. The Nasrid rulers did not merely inherit these streams, they commanded them. They bent rivers and channels to their will, and in doing so, they made their hilltop fortress bloom. The main source was the river Darro, a small but vital watercourse that wound its way through Granada. From this river, engineers carved the Yaskia Reel, or Royal Canal. It was no grand aqueduct soaring across the landscape, but rather a clever and persistent channel that carried water up toward the Alhambra. The canal wound around the hillsides, always maintaining just enough slope to keep water moving, but never too steep to spill it wastefully. When it finally reached the Alhambra, the water was distributed through an intricate web of smaller channels, sluices, and cisterns. The effect was almost magical. Fountains could gurgle endlessly, even on days when the surrounding hills were dry and brown. Pools filled and overflowed in a steady rhythm. Narrow rills carried water along courtyards, cutting geometric paths through tiles and stone. It was as though the rulers had convinced a mountain stream to play the role of obedient servant, forever repeating its lines on cue. Practical uses were hidden behind the spectacle. The water-powered mills at the base of the hill ground grain for bread and filled cisterns that ensured a constant supply for cooking and washing. In the gem relief, the ruler's country estate just above the Alhambra, the same system irrigated orchards of pomegranates, olives, and citrus. Here, water was the difference between bare hillside and lush garden. Visitor, walking through the shaded paths of the gem relief, would have heard the steady trickle of channels, the gentle splash of fountains, and known, without needing to be told, that this was no accident of nature but the result of human ingenuity. The symbolism was layered. In Islamic tradition, Gardens watered by flowing streams recalled paradise, described in scripture as a place where rivers of life-giving substances flowed eternally. To sit in a courtyard where water divided the ground into 4 sections, as in the court of the lions, was to be surrounded by echoes of this divine vision. The water itself became a metaphor, whispering that the ruler who controlled it also held the keys to prosperity and divine favor. There was also the matter of sound. The designers of the Alhambra understood that water spoke. A gushing fountain declared abundance, while a thin trickle offered intimacy. The murmur of channels along tiled floors created a continuous backdrop, masking unwanted noises and giving the impression of calm. In a courtyard, a single stream could fill silence without overwhelming it, like a voice that spoke softly but never stopped. Visitors may not have realized it consciously, but the sound guided their emotions, easing them into the atmosphere of the space. Light, too, played games with water. Pools reflected not only the arches and walls but also the shifting sky. A breeze might ruffle the surface, distorting the reflection into patterns that seemed alive. Lamps lit at night turned fountains into glittering circles, while moonlight doubled itself on the surface of the pools. Water and light together created illusions that blurred the line between material and ethereal, making stone feel less heavy, more dreamlike. Maintaining all this was a constant task. Channels had to be cleared of silts, fountains repaired, pools cleaned. Servants and laborers worked quietly to keep the illusion alive. For the rulers, the effort was worth it. Each drop of water that sparkled in the sun or echoed in the night was proof of their command over nature. In a land where peasants sometimes struggled to irrigate their fields, the palace could afford to waste water on reflections and ripples. That contrast was part of the spectacle, paradise for the few, reminder for the many. Yet the water system was not only a showpiece for royalty. The Courtyards also served the needs of the broader city, feeding public fountains and bathhouses. In this way, the lifeblood of the Alhambra reached into the daily life of Granada's inhabitants. A woman filling her jar at a public fountain was part of the same system that powered the Sultan's ornate courtyard displays. The connection may not have been comforting, but it was real. The Generalif, whose name may derive from Jannat al-Arif, often translated as Garden of the Architect or Garden of the Overseer, demonstrated the fullest use of water as a partner in design. Here, long channels of water ran between flower beds, fountains rose in tiers, and shaded courtyards opened to vistas of the valley below. The estate was a retreat from the formal pressures of the Alhambra, a place for leisure, poetry, and rest. But its courtyards were no less carefully staged. Water was everywhere, never still for long, reminding even in play that paradise required constant flow. It is easy to forget, wandering these gardens today, that all of this depended on a fragile balance. A drought, an earthquake, or a failed repair could have silenced the fountains. Political upheaval could cut off the canal. The fact that the water still flows centuries later is a quiet testament to the skill of the engineers who first carved the channels. Their work has outlasted the dynasties, the conquests, and even the memory of their name. Water gave Granada its identity. The city's very name, though usually linked to the pomegranate fruit, also resonates with the idea of granaries and fertility, a place of abundance in an often arid land. Without the steady flow engineered by the Courtyards, the Alhambra would have been a sun-baked fortress, imposing but lifeless. With water, it became a dream of paradise, shimmering with life. From the rivers and channels, the narrative now drifts toward the role of light itself. the other half of the courtyard's enchantment, shaping every surface and shifting with every hour of the day. Light was as crucial to the Alhambra and Granada's courtyards as water. Without light, the reflections in pools would have been meaningless. The play of shadows on carved stucco invisible, the illusions incomplete. In Moorish architecture, light was not a brute force flooding a space. It was a delicate partner, coaxed and filtered until it behaved as part of the design. To walk through these courtyards was to drift in a shifting theatre of brightness and shadow, where every step revealed a new scene. The architects understood that direct sunlight in Andalusia could be harsh. Instead of opening large windows to the outside, they turned spaces inward. Courtyards collected light from above, softening it as it filtered through leaves, lattices, or awnings. The result was not blinding brilliance, but dappled shimmer. A wall of white plaster caught the sun and scattered it gently. Tiles of deep blue and green absorbed and reflected it in quieter tones. Arches created pockets of shadow where light could pool and retreat, giving rhythm to otherwise still surfaces. Patterns carved into stucco became instruments for light. The shallow reliefs of geometric forms and arabesques responded to changing angles of the sun. In the morning, a motif might stand out boldly. By evening, it could sink back into obscurity. This shifting made stone appear alive, as if the building itself breathed in the light and exhaled shadow. The visual effect was subtle but hypnotic, especially in long colonnades, where column after column caught the sun at slightly different angles, producing a slow-motion ripple of brightness. Light also worked hand in hand with water. Pools doubled the world, showing walls and skies inverted. A bird flying overhead became a fleeting reflection, its shadow gliding across the surface before vanishing. Clouds drifted twice, once in the sky, once in the pool. At night, the moon appeared in courtyards as a companionable twin, resting quietly in still water. The lamps and torches amplified this. Their flames multiplied into countless flickering fragments. Even a modest fountain seemed theatrical when a single flame cast shifting gold across its rip. There was a spiritual dimension, too. In Islamic art and thought, light carried profound symbolism, often linked to divine presence and knowledge. Courtyards that orchestrated light and shadow became more than practical designs. They were metaphors in stone. A shaft of light illuminating a calligraphic inscription might remind a visitor of divine truth. A shadowed arcade leading into sudden brightness could echo spiritual journeys from ignorance to awareness. The architecture never shouted these messages, but whispered them, allowing each observer to absorb as much or as little as they wished. Daily rhythms amplified the effect. Morning light, sharp and cool, gave courtyards a sense of freshness. Midday light, harsh on the streets, was tamed in patios by shade and reflection. Evening light, warm and low, turned stucco golden and water bronze. Each hour carried its own mood, and courtyards became clocks of atmosphere, measuring time not by mechanical gears but by how walls and pools responded to the sun. In winter, when the sun sat lower, light angled further into colonnades, warming spaces that otherwise felt cold. In summer, when the sun was high, the same courtyards remained shaded and cool. The architecture responded naturally, without moving parts, just careful orientation and proportions. It was a form of environmental control, centuries ahead of its time, and it added to the sense that these spaces belonged in a world slightly more perfect than the ordinary one outside. Travelers later remarked on the dreamlike light of the Alhambra, poets in the 19th century when the palace was rediscovered by romantic writers and painters, described it in terms bordering on fantasy, yet their awe was grounded in real effects, created long before their visits. The Nasrid architects had known how to bend sunlight to their purpose, not with glass windows or artificial lenses, but with proportion, color, and surface. The courtyards were lessons in how light could be taught to speak. Sometimes the absence of light was just as important. Darkened passageways connected bright patios, so that entering a courtyard felt like an unveiling. Eyes adjusted from shadow to brilliance, and the sudden sight of fountains sparkling in sun carried greater impact. The contrast was deliberate. Just as water was channeled carefully, so was light. Neither was left to chance. Both were guided, as if the architects were stage managers of nature itself. The most famous example is the Hall of the Two Sisters, adjacent to the Court of the Lions. Its domed ceiling is filled with thousands of tiny cells forming a honeycomb-like pattern known as a mekana. Light filtering in from high windows catches these cells, making the dome appear like a sky filled with stars. At different times of day, different clusters of cells are illuminated, so that the dome seems to shift endlessly. The name Hall of the Two Sisters may sound domestic, but the experience of standing under its shifting starlight is anything but ordinary. In smaller courtyards, household life unfolded, and a gentler play. A lattice screen might scatter sunlight into a mosaic of shapes across the floor. Vines climbing walls softened the glare, leaves trembling in wind to create moving patterns. Children would have grown up with these daily displays as normal, their games taking place in light that never stood still. For them, paradise may not have seemed extraordinary. It was simply home. Light, like water, was fragile. Dust storms dimmed it, clouds muted it, and changes in construction could ruin carefully calibrated effect. Restorers centuries later have sometimes struggled to recapture the original interplay, knowing that even slight alterations in plaster orientation can silence what was once eloquent. The surviving brilliance reminds us not only of what was achieved, but of how easily it might have been lost. The courtyards of Granada, in their interplay of water and light, created an environment that was both sensory and symbolic. They invited visitors to linger, to look twice, to notice how the world could be reshaped without force. In doing so, they expressed a philosophy of beauty that was quiet, persistent, and enduring. From the play of light, the path now leads to the echoes these courtyards carried, the sounds that gave them another layer of meaning, turning stone and water into instruments of memory and mood. Sound in the courtyards of Moorish Granada was never accidental. Just as water was guided through narrow channels and light was coaxed into patterns on walls, so too was sound shaped by stone, tile, and art. To walk into one of these spaces was to enter a carefully tuned instrument, where the smallest noise could swell or fade depending on how it struck the surfaces. Even silence itself carried weight, interrupted only by the murmur of fountains, so the whisper of wind through myrtle hedges. The courtyards of the Alhambra often amplified subtle sounds. The gentle drip of water from a carved spout could echo against stucco walls, repeating faintly like a slow heartbeat. A breeze rattling leaves in the Gendrelif gardens might sound louder than expected, as if the architecture encouraged nature to speak up. Soft footsteps on tiles became part of the soundscape, a reminder that humans were participants in this orchestrated environment rather than intruders. For rulers and courtiers, this manipulation of sound was not just pleasant, it was political. Imagine an ambassador arriving in the court of the Myrtles. The quiet splash of water dominated the space, While conversations remained hushed, voices had to adapt to the acoustics, forcing speakers to lower their tones. Authority in such a place was not asserted through shouting, but through soft words that carried easily across the courtyard. Power was exercised by stillness, not noise. The Hall of the Ambassadors took this further. Its lofty dome and geometric surfaces created a resonance that magnified even ordinary speech. When the Sultan spoke from his throne, his voice filled the chamber without the need for force. Visitors, hearing their own words bounce back faintly, may have felt as though the building itself was listening. In this way, architecture shaped conversation, nudging it toward formality and restraint. Domestic courtyards, though smaller, had their own acoustics. Children's laughter would bounce between walls, while the splash of a small fountain kept rhythm. Cooking sounds, clay pots clinking, wooden spoons stirring, mingled with birdsong from caged finches or sparrows perched on tiled roofs. These echoes made the home feel both enclosed and alive. In such spaces, families could share meals or prayers while surrounded by sound that softened the boundaries between daily life and quiet contemplation. Bathhouses within the Alhambra and city echoed differently. Steam softened noise, and domed ceilings scattered it in gentle reverberations. Water poured into basins with a hushed gurgle, while voices carried strangely, both near and far, at once. To soak in such a place was to listen, as much as to bathe. Sounds lingered, faded, then returned, reminding bathers that the architecture itself was part of their company. Poetry and music also found natural stages in courtyards. Antilosi, musicians played the oud, a pear-shaped lute, or beat small drums, while singers chanted verses. The acoustics made the music linger, wrapping listeners in layers of melody. Poems recited aloud gained resonance from the echoing arches, as though the words were confirmed by the space itself. For rulers, this blending of art and architecture was useful. It reminded guests that Granada was not only a military power, but also a place of refinement, where beauty was a form of authority. Religious echoes carried their own weight. The call to prayer, delivered from minarets, drifted over rooftops and down alleys, reaching courtyards where families paused to wash or pray. Within mosque courtyards, the sound of worshippers murmuring in unison created a low hum amplified by surrounding arcades. Even in private homes, recitations of scripture took on new depth as words bounced softly around tiled walls. The faith of Granada was not only spoken but acoustically embodied in stone and water. One cannot forget the darker echoes. Political intrigue often filled these spaces, carried on hushed voices that sought secrecy but found themselves half amplified by walls. A rival's betrayal, a family quarrel, or an anxious discussion about the advance of Christian armies might linger in the air longer than intended. Courtyards that promised tranquility could not always protect their occupants from the resonance of fear. In a city always aware of its precarious position, even the echoes reminded people that nothing spoken was ever entirely private. Later, when the Alhambra fell to Christian rule, new sounds entered. Church bells replaced the call to prayer, their peals echoing off the same walls that had once framed Islamic recitations. Soldiers' boots clattered where courtiers once glided in slippers. The fountains, stubbornly constant, continued their murmur, outlasting the changes above them. The courtyards, tuned for one kind of sound, adapted with indifferent patience to another. Today, the courtyards of Granada are filled with new echoes. The shuffle of tourist shoes, the click of cameras, the chatter of guides in many languages. Yet beneath the modern noise, The same acoustic qualities endure. A fountain still dominates the space, softening the edges of voices. A bird call still seems louder than expected. If one stands still long enough, the centuries blur and the courtyard resumes its timeless role as an instrument of sound. The orchestration of echoes shows that Moorish Granada valued more than appearances. It understood atmosphere, the way environments could shape emotions through sound as much as through sight. The courtyard was not only something to look at, but something to inhabit with all the senses. Its quiet music of water, wind, and voice was as carefully composed as any poem or song, with echoes fading in the mind. Attention now turns to the people who lived within these courtyards, the rulers, their families, and the courtiers whose fortunes rose and fell under the arches and fountains of Granada. The courtyards of Moorish Granada did not live on water and light alone. They were filled with people, rulers, servants, poets, guards, children, each carrying their own role in the quiet drama of daily life. To understand these spaces fully, one must picture the humans who walked across the tiles, leaned against the columns, and paused to watch their reflections in the pools. Without them, the courtyards would have been nothing more than elegant shells. The Nasrid sultans, who ruled Granada from the mid-13th century until 1492, lived at the heart of these courtyards. They were not always secure on their thrones. Family rivalries, rebellions, and shifting alliances made their rule fragile. Yet within the Alhambra, they projected an image of unshakable stability. When Muhammad expanded the Court of the Lions, he was not simply adding a pleasant garden, he was crafting a political symbol. Walking among the fountain's channels, he could appear as a shepherd of abundance, a ruler whose authority flowed smoothly in all directions. The courtyards allowed him to stage his reign as serene, even when turmoil boiled outside the gates. Royal women occupied smaller courtyards within the harem quarters. Their lives were less public, but no less significant. They shaped dynastic politics through marriage alliances and the delicate matter of succession. Mothers of young princes often wielded influence behind the scenes, and their conversations, whispered beside fountains or under lattice work, could determine the future of the kingdom. Though historians rarely recorded their voices, the courtyards remember them in their secluded spaces, designed for privacy and family life. Children, too, grew up in these patios. Their games echoed under arches, their laughter mingling with the splash of water. They chased shadows, learned letters under the watchful eyes of tutors, and absorbed the rhythms of life in a palace that was both fortress and home. For them, the courtyards were playgrounds and classrooms alike, where paradise was not a distant hope, but the daily backdrop of growing up. Courtiers and officials brought another layer of life. They attended audiences in the grand halls, but they also lingered in courtyards, discussing policies or quietly lobbying for favor. A shaded arcade provided cover for subtle negotiations, while a fountain masked the sound of cautious conversations. For these men, success or failure often hinged on words spoken softly in such spaces. The courtyards were not only gardens, but arenas of ambition. Servants maintained the illusion of paradise. They swept tiles, trimmed hedges, and repaired channels to keep the water flowing. Their work was largely invisible, yet essential. The ruler could only appear as master of abundance because teams of workers labored tirelessly to preserve the effect. In this sense, the courtyards were both stage and backstage, their beauty dependent on effort that visitors were not meant to notice. The courtyards also attracted poets, scholars, and artists. Granada was famous for its culture, and many writers found inspiration in the interplay of water and stone. Poets compared fountains to stars, courtyards to heavens, and rulers to guardians of paradise. Some of their verses were literally carved into walls, turning architecture into a library. To recite a poem in a courtyard was to merge sound, text, and setting into one seamless expression. The lives of ordinary townspeople also intersected with these spaces, though often indirectly. The artisans who crafted tiles, carved stucco, or laid bricks brought their skills into the courtyards, leaving behind traces of their labor. Merchants delivering goods to the Alhambra passed through outer courts, glimpsing splashes of grandeur. Pilgrims visiting mosques in the Albaycin prayed in open courtyards, their voices adding to the city-wide chorus of devotion. Though most never entered the royal patios, they lived in smaller versions within their own homes, echoing the same design on a humbler scale. When Christian forces closed in on Granada in the late 15th century, the courtyards witnessed tension and sorrow. The last Nazarid ruler, Mohammed XII, known to later Spanish chroniclers as Boabdil, walked these spaces under the weight of imminent loss. His court, diminished and uncertain, still gathered in the same courtyards that once symbolized abundance. Water still flowed, light still shimmered, but the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. To stand in the court of the lions at that moment must have been to feel paradise slipping through one's fingers. After the conquest in 1492, new people entered. Spanish soldiers marched through patios once reserved for courtiers. Catholic monarchs admired the beauty, even as they planted their own Renaissance structures within the complex. Servants changed, routines shifted, but the courtyards endured. They adapted, as they always had, to the humans who inhabited them. Centuries later, travelers from across Europe came seeking the romance of the East. Poets like Washington Irving stayed in the Alhambra, writing dreamy tales of Moorish ghosts and lost treasures. His tales of the Alhambra made the courtyards famous again, though in a haze of nostalgia and invention. Tourists arrived, their footsteps echoing where sultans once strolled. The people had changed, but the courtyards remained ready to host them, reflecting faces in pools just as they had for Nazarid rulers centuries before. In the end, the courtyards were both personal and collective. They held private lives, children's games, mothers' whispers, poets' musings, but they also mirrored the fate of a dynasty and a city. They were stages where ambition rose and fell, where joy and loss coexisted, where every figure from sultan to servant played a role in the quiet theater of paradise, imagined and paradise lost. With the people in mind, the focus now turns to the courtyard's legacy, the way they survived conquest, neglect, and reinvention, carrying their echoes into the modern world. The fall of Granada in 1492 marked the end of Muslim rule in Iberia, but the courtyards did not vanish with the dynasty that built them. Instead, they endured, adapting to new rulers, new religions, and new purposes. The Alhambra itself, though altered, remained a living monument. Its courtyards shifted roles, hosting conquerors, clerics, and later lotus, yet their essential atmosphere, water, light, and echo proved strangely resistant to time. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, were pragmatic enough not to destroy what they had captured. They admired the Alhambra's beauty, and even used its palaces as residences for a time. They commissioned their own Renaissance additions, most dramatically the Palace of Charles V, an austere circle planted in the middle of the Nazarid complex, like an intrusive guest who insists on redecorating. Yet the Moorish courtyard survived alongside it, their quietness contrasting sharply with the heavy stone of the new construction. Over the centuries, the Alhambra fell into neglect. Portions crumbled, some courtyards were overgrown, and others were repurposed by garrisons or squatters. Yet even in disrepair, the essence remained. Travelers who visited in the 17th and 8th centuries wrote of ruined fountains still trickling, of echoing chambers half collapsed, yet still luminous with filtered light. The courtyards seemed to resist complete ruin, as if the design itself carried resilience. The romantic rediscovery of the Alhambra in the 19th century brought new attention. Writers like Washington Irving stayed among its courtyards, spinning tales of Moorish ghosts and enchanted fountains. His tales of the Alhambra introduced the palace to a wide audience, and though his stories blurred history and legend, they reignited interest in preserving the complex. Painters followed, sketching courtyards with lions, myrtles, and archers, exporting images of Granada's paradise to salons across Europe. Restoration efforts began, sometimes with heavy hands, sometimes with care. Tiles were replaced, walls replastered, fountains repaired. The challenge was always to preserve the atmosphere without turning the courtyards into museum pieces. For the courtyards lived not only in stone and water, but in the interplay of senses, the shimmer of light, the murmur of water, the resonance of footsteps. Freeze them too rigidly, and they would lose the very life that defined them. Granada itself continued the tradition of courtyards. Beyond the Alhambra, Christian houses adopted patios, monasteries built cloisters, and even modern apartments sometimes opened inward. The language of water and light proved too useful and too beautiful to abandon. Today, walking through the Albazacin or the Rialejo, one still glimpses courtyards behind wooden gates, orange trees, tiled fountains, shaded arcades, remnants of a design philosophy that refused to fade. Tourism eventually transformed the Alhambra into one of the most visited monuments in Spain. Crowds fill the courtyards daily, cameras clicking where once poets whispered. Yet the courtyards remain strangely resilient. Even among tourists, the hush of the Court of the Myrtles imposes itself, as if the pool insists on silence. The Court of the Lions, ringed by slender columns, still gathers light and shadow with quiet authority. Guides may chatter, but the fountains speak more steadily, their sound older than words. The legacy of these spaces is more than architectural. They remind us of how environments can shape experience. The courtyards of Moorish Granada were not accidental decorations, but carefully orchestrated worlds designed to soften heat, calm noise, and suggest paradise. They show how beauty can be practical and how practicality can be beautiful. They suggest that power can be staged not only through armies or monuments, but through the quiet persuasion of water flowing endlessly in the sun. They also remind us of impermanence. The Nasrid dynasty believed its courtyards mirrored eternity, yet their rule ended abruptly. The fountains still flow, indifferent to politics, while rulers' names fade into history. The courtyards endure precisely because they do not cling to any single era. They adapt, welcoming conquerors, poets, tourists, each in turn. Their legacy is not one of static memory, but of continuous presence. In the end, the hidden courtyards of Moorish Granada are less about the past than about timeless human desires for coolness in heat, for quiet in chaos, for glimpses of paradise in daily life. They remain lessons in how architecture can turn necessity into poetry, and how spaces, carefully shaped, can hold the power to soothe across centuries. Silence falls for a moment, but it's only the breath before another storm. Behind the quiet, something stirs, an untold chapter waiting to unfold in all its strangeness. This is the painted streets of Pompeii. Murals, markets, and moments frozen in ash. Pompeii. The name itself conjures images of towering ash clouds and slow, inevitable destruction. But before it became synonymous with volcanic eruptions and its tragic end, Pompeii was a city alive with color, commerce, and the constant buzz of human activity. Imagine it: narrow streets lined with vibrant murals, marketplaces alive with the sounds of haggling, the smells of food cooking, and the soft murmur of daily life. For the people of Pompeii, their world was a bright and busy one, and in a way, the paintings they left behind in their homes and public spaces act as echoes of their lives. This was a world frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, but also a world preserved, not merely preserved by the ash and pumice, but by the images they left behind on the walls of their homes, baths, and even the places they gathered for business. Silence falls for a moment, but it's only the breath before another storm. Behind the quiet, something stirs, an untold chapter waiting to unfold in all its strangeness. This is the painted streets of Pompeii. Murals, markets, and moments frozen in ash. Pompeii. The name itself conjures images of towering ash clouds and slow, inevitable destruction. But before it became synonymous with volcanic eruptions and its tragic end, Pompeii was a city alive with color, commerce, and the constant buzz of human activity. Imagine it: narrow streets lined with vibrant murals, marketplaces alive with the sounds of haggling, the smells of food cooking, and the soft murmur of daily life. For the people of Pompeii, their world was a bright and busy one, and in a way, the paintings they left behind in their homes and public spaces act as echoes of their lives. This was a world frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, but also a world preserved, not merely preserved by the ash and pumice, but by the images they left behind on the walls of their homes, baths, and even the places they gathered for business. Walking through the streets of Pompeii, if one could do so without the heavy shroud of modern archaeology, there would have been murals everywhere, not just in the grand villas of the wealthy, but also in humble homes, where the walls themselves became canvases for the stories, symbols, and ideals of the time. The practice of painting was widespread, and for many, it was part of everyday life. A simple wall could bear intricate depictions of Greek mythology, geometric patterns, or images meant to convey the owner's social status. These were not mere decorations, but expressions of the people's worldview, their tastes, their hopes, and even their fears. Many of Pompeii's murals seem to be reflections of the values of Roman society, particularly those that were dominated by wealth and power. However, they also reveal something else, a city that was not unlike any other bustling urban center. The paintings are a window into the lives of ordinary people, showing moments of quiet domesticity, playful scenes from mythology, and depictions of life's more joyful and more melancholic moments. And yet, despite all the vivid color and life, the volcano was always there in the background, a silent force waiting to remind everyone of nature's ultimate power. Before Vesuvius erupted, Pompeii was a Roman city at its peak. Situated along the Bay of Naples, it was a bustling town filled with merchants, artists, politicians, and travelers. The streets were often packed, not unlike those of any major city today. The marketplaces were full of the sounds of bartering, and vendors hawked everything from produce to pottery to exotic spices. Goods flowed in and out of the city's gates, carried by the ships that docked along the harbor. Pompeii was at its core a city of connections, local connections within the community, and global connections that brought together the far corners of the Roman Empire. The murals reflect this vibrancy. If you walked into one of Pompeii's public baths, for example, You might have found yourself looking at murals that depicted scenes of everyday Roman life, workers laboring in the fields, traders bargaining with one another, gods watching over the scene with an air of detachment. It was almost as if the walls were capturing the ordinary moments of life, elevating them to something divine. To the people of Pompeii, perhaps it wasn't so unusual. Their daily lives were filled with the weight of myth and history, where gods, heroes, and emperors were ever-present figures. Inside homes, the paintings were a bit more personal. Murals adorned dining rooms, bedrooms, and corridors, serving both as decoration and as statements of wealth and social standing. Wealthy Romans, especially those with more expansive homes, employed artists to create elaborate frescoes that could cover entire walls. These murals weren't just aesthetic, they were carefully chosen to reflect the tastes of the owner. Some walls were decorated with lush landscapes that gave the impression of open space and light, while others featured detailed scenes from Roman mythology, like the labors of Hercules or the story of the Trojan War. But what is perhaps most striking about the murals of Pompeii is their timelessness. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried the city in a thick blanket of volcanic ash and pumice, preserving it in a state of suspended animation. While the people of Pompeii perished in the disaster, their homes, their businesses, their walls frozen. The ash, rather than erasing the city, acted as a preservative. Over the centuries, as the ash was slowly removed, the murals began to reveal their colors, their details, their stories. It's almost as though the eruption didn't end the city, but in a way gave it a new life, preserving it for future generations to see. Pompeii's murals, however, are more than just remnants of a city long gone. They are windows into the soul of the Roman world, a world where politics, religion, and daily life all bled together. The paintings tell the stories of a society that believed in the power of the gods, the importance of status, and the necessity of indulgence. But they also tell the stories of the common people, the tradesmen, the soldiers, the citizens who lived and worked in Pompeii's narrow streets, who were as concerned with getting a good deal at the market as they were with the whims of the gods. In some of Pompeii's most famous murals, the viewer can see gods and mortals intertwined in a dance of power and submission. In others, the focus is on simple pleasures, banquets, feasts, the enjoyment of life's more sensual pleasures. There are paintings of reclining women, seemingly dim from the idealized images of the Roman elite. And there are also murals of everyday objects like flowers, fruits, and even small animals, captured in such detail that they almost seem to come alive. Yet, for all the beauty and vibrancy of Pompeii's murals, there is also something dark about them. Beneath the color and life, beneath the depictions of gods and feasts, lies a sense of fragility. The very walls that once proudly displayed these works are now weathered and decaying, their colors slowly fading with each passing year. The city itself is no longer a place of commerce and connection, but a silent ruin, preserved in time, as if waiting for someone to listen, to remember. In some ways, Pompeii's murals serve as an almost eerie reminder of how fleeting life can be. The city was so full of life, so full of people living and working and laughing, and then in an instant, it was gone. The eruption of Vesuvius was a catastrophe, yes, but it was also a moment of preservation, freezing everything in place. The same murals that once adorned bustling homes now serve as memorials, reminding us of a way of life that was lost to time. As you step through the ruins of Pompeii today, it's easy to imagine the city as it once was, alive with movement, filled with the voices of its people, the colors of its murals, and the ever-present sense that life was continuing, moment by moment. Yet, as the ash from Vesuvius still lingers on the ground and the walls still hold the echoes of that long-lost time. It's as if the city itself is quietly waiting for us to remember not just the destruction, but the life, the laughter, and the art that once filled these now silent streets. As the dust of Pompeii's destruction settled, and the first archaeologists carefully excavated the buried city, it became clear that Pompeii had been more than just a collection of homes and baths. It had been a city that thrived on trade, where markets buzzed with the clatter of commerce, where goods flowed freely from all corners of the empire, and where the hustle and bustle of daily life created a rhythm that echoed down the narrow streets. Pompeii's markets, though long abandoned, still hold a kind of pulse, a sense of life that once coursed through the city's veins. Today, these marketplaces, while silent and broken, stand as some of the most vivid reminders of what Pompeii once was, a center of commerce, culture, and connection. The artifacts found here, and the remains of the shops themselves, paint a picture of a city that was both incredibly sophisticated and remarkably down to earth. The people of Pompeii, it seems, knew how to balance work and play, indulgence and practicality. At the heart of Pompeii's economy was its location. Nestled on the Bay of Naples, the city had easy access to the sea, which made it an important trading hub. Goods from the far reaches of the Roman Empire flowed into Pompeii. You could find spices from Egypt, wine from the vineyards of Italy, glass from the eastern Mediterranean, and textiles from distant regions. Pompeii, much like any major city today, was a melting pot of cultures and flavors, where traders and merchants interacted daily, sharing stories, goods, and ideas. The largest and most famous of Pompeii's markets was the Forum, a sprawling space in the center of the city that served as the hub for political, religious, and economic activity. The Forum wasn't just the place where the city's leaders gathered to debate and decide, though that certainly happened. It was also the heart of the city's commerce. It was lined with shops and stalls that sold everything from food to tools to luxury goods. The stones that make up the streets of the Forum are worn from centuries of footsteps, and yet they still carry the weight of all those who passed through. You can almost hear the clamor of voices, the exchanges of money, the polite haggling, and the occasional laugh. The shop fronts in Pompeii were often small, simple spaces that offered a glimpse into the daily lives of their owners. These shops were not just storefronts, but were integral to the city's social fabric. From the humble baker's shop to the upscale merchants selling imported goods, these places were the lifeblood of the community. In many ways, they operated like today's small businesses, where personal relationships were just as important as the goods being sold. The bakers' shops were particularly interesting. Archaeologists have found the remains of ovens and tools that were used to make bread, along with depictions of bread and cakes on the walls. One mural, found in a bakery, shows a woman holding a loaf of bread, while others depict scenes of dough being kneaded and loaves being baked. These murals are more than just decoration. They are evidence of the essential role that food played in Pompeii's daily life. Bread was the staple of the Roman diet, and its production was not only a trade, but a form of artistry. To be a baker in Pompeii wasn't just about selling bread, it was about creating a product that symbolized the connection between nourishment and society itself. Pompeii's markets weren't just limited to foodstuffs, though there were also shops selling textiles, pottery, and even luxury items like jewelry. The goods available in these markets reflected the status and tastes of Pompeii's citizens. While the majority of people probably couldn't afford to buy imported glassware or exotic perfumes, the items sold in the markets were varied enough to cater to all classes. In fact, Pompeii had a particularly vibrant artisan community, with skilled workers producing everything from pottery to sculptures. For those with a bit of wealth, Pompeii also had a selection of luxury goods. Wealthy Romans could stroll through the streets of the city and purchase fine wines, rare spices, and even exotic animals. One of the most fascinating aspects of Pompeii's markets is the sheer variety of goods that were traded. Pompeii wasn't just a city of practical purchases. It was a place where indulgence was available to those who had the means. The elite in Pompeii, much like elites in any society, enjoyed their comforts and their luxuries. They might have bought fine frescoes for their homes, or exquisite jewelry to wear at banquets. For these people, the market was a place of both necessity and pleasure. While the markets were buzzing with activity, it was the shops that dotted the city's streets that revealed the true nature of Pompeii's commerce. Unlike the Grand Forum, which was a place for larger transactions and social gatherings, the smaller shops offered a glimpse into the more personal, everyday side of Roman life. Imagine walking down one of Pompeii's streets and seeing a small, tidy shop selling pottery. The pottery might have been used for cooking, for storage, or for decoration, but there was something about each piece that reflected the skill of the artisan and the culture of the time. The pottery wasn't just functional. It was a form of expression, a reflection of the people who lived in the city. Other shops sold oils, perfumes, and cosmetics. These items were used not just for hygiene, but also for social status. The wealthy elite often used perfumes made from rare flowers and spices, and even the common people had their own local favorites. The fragrance of Pompeii, as imagined from the remnants of these shops, must have been a blend of spices, flowers, and the earthy smell of the market itself. In some ways, the market was a place where everything came together. The smells of food, the vibrant colors of textiles, the chatter of buyers and sellers, all mixing to create a unique atmosphere. This sense of daily life, of ordinary activities intertwined with the grander structures of Roman society, was what made Pompeii feel so alive. It was a place where the mundane and the extraordinary met, where the cycles of life played out in a way that was both familiar and fascinating. The markets of Pompeii were, in essence, a microcosm of the city itself. They were a place of commerce, yes, but also a place of connection, where people interacted with one another in ways that reflected the culture, class, and values of the time. The tradespeople, artisans, and merchants who worked in these markets weren't just selling products. They were selling a way of life, one that emphasized the importance of community, culture, and commerce. While the public spaces of Pompeii, its markets, baths, and grand buildings, often steal the spotlight in discussions of the ancient city, it is within the private homes of Pompeii that we can catch a more intimate glimpse of Roman life. These homes, ranging from the modest to the magnificent, were not merely places to sleep. They were carefully curated spaces filled with art, color, and meaning. The walls of Pompeii's homes spoke not just of the people who lived there, but of the culture they were part of and the aspirations they held. As you walk through the streets of Pompeii, you would pass the facades of houses, often simple, unassuming entrances. There wasn't much to distinguish one from another at first glance, except for the occasional bit of decoration. Once inside, though, the difference between the wealthy and the modestly comfortable becomes clear. The homes of Pompeii were, for the most part, compact, but beautifully appointed. The wealthy had villas with lush courtyards, gardens, and extravagant frescoes, while the humbler homes had their own charm, decorated with simpler, yet still carefully selected art and functional pieces. One of the most iconic features of Pompeii's homes is the atrium, an open central courtyard that was typically surrounded by rooms for living, dining, and socializing. The atrium was not just a practical space, it was the heart of the home, and it often doubled as a place for greeting visitors and conducting business. Imagine stepping into one of these homes after a long, busy day, entering a cool, open space that was shaded from the sun. The atrium was designed to bring the outside in, with skylights letting in natural light and sometimes even small water features that added to the ambiance. The sounds of the city, of markets, of laughter, of life were muted here, creating a peaceful, contemplative space. The walls of Pompeii's homes were almost always decorated with murals. These murals weren't just for decoration, they were a reflection of the owner's status, tastes, and ambitions. The wealthier the owner, the more elaborate and intricate the paintings. Some homes featured intricate landscapes, with lush gardens and distant views of the sea. Others depicted mythological scenes, like the heroic feats of gods or legendary figures, filling the walls with stories of power, beauty, and grandeur. The use of mythological imagery wasn't just for the wealthy. It was a way of connecting the home to the larger Roman cultural tradition, a kind of visual shorthand for status and education. Yet, not all homes in Pompeii were adorned with such grand, sweeping mythological scenes. In many of the simpler homes, the art was more personal and intimate. Some homes featured smaller, more domestic themes, flowers, animals, and scenes from everyday life. The murals in these homes were often not grandiose depictions of gods or emperors, but representations of ordinary things, like the food they ate, the animals they kept, and the beauty they appreciated in the world around them. One of the most fascinating things about the private homes of Pompeii is the way they reflected the personalities and aspirations of their owners. Take, for example, the House of the Faun, one of the largest and most luxurious homes in the city. This grand villa, covering more than 6,000 square feet, was filled with exquisite works of art, including stunning frescoes and mosaics. The walls were covered with depictions of the Greek gods, and the floors were adorned with intricate mosaic scenes. The centerpiece of the home, however, was the statue of a faun, a creature from Greek mythology reflecting the owner's appreciation for the classical traditions of the Greeks, as well as his apparent fondness for the mythical and the playful. Another famous home, the House of the Vetai, offers a glimpse into the world of Pompeii's wealthy merchant class. The murals in this house are notable for their vivid colors and dramatic depictions of mythological themes. The house is often cited as a prime example of the way wealthy Pompeians used art to convey their education and refinement. In the House of the Vetai, the rooms were decorated with large frescoes depicting gods, heroes, and everyday scenes, all designed to impress visitors with the homeowner's wealth, knowledge, and taste. The house's decor was a visual representation of the owner's status, designed to make a statement about their place in the social hierarchy of the city. But it wasn't just the wealthy who made art a part of their homes. Even the more modest homes of Pompeii, those that might seem unremarkable from the outside, boasted their own unique decorations. Some homes featured small but intricate frescoes, often depicting scenes of daily life or the natural world. There were paintings of fish and birds, of farmers ploughing fields, and women working at looms. These were images that spoke to the ordinary person's life, a reminder of their connection to the land, to work, and to the community around them. They may not have had the resources to create grand mythological masterpieces, but their homes were filled with art that was just as meaningful, if not more so. These frescoes weren't just decorative. In many cases, they were designed to serve a symbolic function. Roman art often had deeper meanings that went beyond what was immediately visible. The mythological scenes, for instance, weren't just about illustrating the exploits of gods and heroes. They were about conveying ideas of power, virtue, and morality. To have a mural of Hercules defeating the Hydra on your wall was not just a way to show off your taste. It was a way to align yourself with the virtues of bravery, strength, and honor. Even simpler depictions, like those of animals or harvest scenes, had their own symbolic significance. These paintings might have been reminders of the bounty of nature, the importance of hard work, or the fleeting nature of life. The presence of art in Pompeii's homes speaks to something larger about Roman society itself. The Romans were a people who believed deeply in the power of images to shape thought, to elevate status, and to connect individuals to the larger currents of culture and history. The very act of decorating a home with murals was a way of saying something about the people who lived there, their tastes, their education, and their connection to the wider world. And in that sense, the private homes of Pompeii weren't just places of shelter. They were miniatures of the city itself, places where art, culture, and life came together in the quiet intimacy of home. Whether through the elaborate frescoes of the wealthy or the simple yet heartfelt images of the everyday person, these homes were filled with the quiet stories of a society that understood the power of art to shape not just their physical environment, but their understanding of who they were in the world. If there is one thing that the ancient Romans knew how to do, it was take a bath. But the Roman bath wasn't just about cleanliness. It was a complex communal experience that involved socializing, relaxation, and a bit of self-care. And in Pompeii, the baths were not only places of hygiene, but also centers of daily life, social interaction, and even business. These places were where people gathered, not only to cleanse their bodies, but to refresh their minds and maintain their social standing. In many ways, the public baths of Pompeii were like microcosms of the city itself, spaces where the threads of politics, culture, and social status wove together in the most leisurely of settings. The baths in Pompeii, like in many other Roman cities, were part of a larger system that combined elements of luxury, practicality, and community. The Romans were masters of engineering, and they built baths that were not only functional, but architecturally impressive. The facilities included a series of rooms, each with a specific function, most commonly the frigidarium, cold bath, tepidarium, warm bath, and coldarium, hot bath. Each room was designed to provide a different temperature and atmosphere, encouraging the bather to move through them in a particular order, a ritualistic progression that was almost as much about the experience as the cleanliness. These baths were massive complexes, often grand in scale, and served a wide variety of purposes. They were open to the public, which meant that nearly everyone in Pompeii, whether rich or poor, could access them. The largest and most famous bathhouse in Pompeii is the Stabian baths, which are among the oldest and most well-preserved in the city. Located just outside the city's central forum, the Stabian baths were vast, featuring both men's and women's areas, each with its own set of rooms designed to facilitate the bathing process. The structure was carefully designed, with elaborate heating systems, marble columns, and beautifully crafted mosaics that lined the floors. Visitors would enter through the atrium, pass through the changing rooms, and then move through the different bathing chambers, each offering a different temperature and experience. The coldarium was the hottest room, where bathers would sweat in the heat, while the tepidarium offered a gentler warmth, providing a space for relaxation and conversation. The frigidarium, the coldest room, was typically used at the end of the bathing ritual to close the pores and refresh the body. Each space served not only to clean but to refresh, calm and soothe the soul. Bathing was, after all, about more than just hygiene. It was a form of physical and mental therapy, a time to unwind from the stresses of life. The social aspect of the baths in Pompeii was just as important as the cleansing ritual itself. The baths were a place to meet friends, make deals, and catch up on the latest gossip. The Romans took their bathing seriously, but they also took their social lives seriously. The bathhouse was where men, and sometimes women, gathered to discuss politics, business, and everything in between. It wasn't uncommon for business deals to be struck in the caldarium, or for political alliances to be discussed in the tepidarium, as the water worked its magic on the body and the mind. There were no clear barriers between social classes in the baths, which meant that a wealthy merchant could rub elbows with a politician or an artist while enjoying a hot soak. It was a space where status was still important, but it could be temporarily set aside in favor of a more egalitarian, though still distinctly Roman, form of relaxation. As with other aspects of Pompeian life, the murals and art in the baths tell us a lot about the cultural and social atmosphere of the time. The walls of many bathhouses were decorated with frescoes that depicted scenes of mythological figures, gods, and heroes. These murals were often idealized representations of the human form, a kind of visual shorthand for beauty and strength. The murals in the Stabian baths, for instance, are known for their depiction of athletes and gods, their muscles rippling in scenes of mythological feats of strength. These images reflected the Roman ideal of physical perfection, something that was particularly important in the context of the baths, where the body was both the subject and the object of attention. But while these works of art may have been meant to elevate the experience of bathing, they also reveal something about Roman society's obsession with beauty, health, and strength. Bathing wasn't just about washing away the dirt of the day. It was about cultivating a certain ideal of physicality and health. The baths were, in essence, a place to perfect not just the body, but also one's image, at least as it was reflected in the company of others. People didn't come to the baths just to get clean. They came to present themselves as well-groomed, well-maintained, and fit. Interestingly, the art in the baths also reflected some of the more sensual aspects of Roman culture. Many bathhouses contained murals that depicted romantic or erotic themes, often in the form of playful interactions between gods and mortals. These images were not meant to be shocking or inappropriate, but rather a reflection of the Roman attitude towards sexuality and beauty. The playful depictions of sexual and romantic themes in bathhouses were part of the Roman tradition of arts that both celebrated and normalized such interactions. It was a society where the lines between the sensual and the sacred were often blurred, and the bathhouse was no exception. But for all the socializing, the relaxation, and the indulgence in the bathhouses, there was also an element of ritual involved. Bathing wasn't just a form of leisure, it was a social necessity. For Romans, regular bathing was essential for maintaining good health. The Roman baths were not just places of comfort and relaxation, they were places where the body's well-being was attended to. In fact, many Roman doctors advised regular visits to bathhouse for the maintenance of physical and mental health. The Romans believed that the heat of the caldarium and the cold of the frigidarium had therapeutic properties, and they took their bathing schedules seriously. In Pompeii, the baths were an important part of the community's commitment to both personal and collective health. The role of the baths in Pompeii's society can also be seen in the way they were used for other purposes, such as religious rituals or political gatherings. The public nature of the baths made them ideal venues for these kinds of events. Some bathhouses had dedicated rooms for religious rituals, where bathers could cleanse themselves both physically and spiritually. The baths also functioned as places of community gathering, where citizens could discuss politics, engage in philosophical debates, or even strike business deals. It was a space where life slowed down just enough for people to connect with one another, whether in casual conversation or serious matters of state. For all the grandeur and luxury of the Roman bathhouse, it was also a space of equality. The elite might have enjoyed more lavish surroundings or private chambers, but in the baths, everyone was equal. The poor shared the same spaces as the rich, and while there may have been some level of segregation by class or gender, the bathhouse was an inherently public space. It was a place where people could come together, irrespective of status, to relax, reflect, and rejuvenate. In a city as socially stratified as Pompeii, the public baths provided a rare opportunity for everyone to interact on a more level playing field. As day slipped away in Pompeii, the city did not simply fade into quiet slumber. The night brought with it a different rhythm, a pulse that vibrated through the streets, even as the stars twinkled overhead. The nightlife of Pompeii was just as vibrant and varied as its daytime activities, though it was, of course, tinged with the same complex social dynamics. After the shops closed and the markets quieted, Pompeians would make their way to the taverns, eateries and places of entertainment scattered throughout the city. Whether enjoying a quiet dinner with friends, indulging in food and drink at a public tavern, or attending a more lively performance, the nighttime was when the city truly came alive in a different way. In ancient Pompeii, the evening hours were often spent at one of the many thermopolia public eateries that served hot food and drink. These were not fine dining establishments, but more akin to fast food joints in modern cities, places where people could grab a quick meal after a day of work or meet up with friends for a few drinks. These establishments lined the streets of Pompeii, their brightly painted walls and counters decorated with murals depicting food, drink, and sometimes even patrons. The thermopolia were particularly popular with the working classes, who might not have had the resources to prepare elaborate meals at home. The food served at these places was simple but hearty. Stews, soups, bread, and wine served in generous portions. Archaeologists have discovered that many of these thermopolia had large jars embedded in their counters, which were used to store hot food much like a modern-day soup kettle. For the citizens of Pompeii, the thermopolium was more than just a place to eat. It was also a social space where people could catch up on the latest gossip or discuss the day's events over a warm meal. In addition to the thermopolia, there were also plenty of taverns, or popinae, where patrons could enjoy a more spirited atmosphere. These were the places where people went for a drink, usually wine, sometimes mixed with water or sweetened with honey, and to let loose after a long day. The popinae were often bustling with activity, filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the clinking of cups. These places were less formal than the thermopolia, and were known for being more rowdy, where the lines between social classes often blurred. A wealthy merchant might find himself sharing a table with a humble laborer, or a street vendor, all united by their shared love of good food and drink. The drinks of choice in Pompeii were, unsurprisingly, wine that could be anything from the finest imported varieties to the local, rougher wines served in the taverns. The Romans were masters of wine, having developed complex techniques for cultivating, aging, and blending different varieties. Wine was so ubiquitous in Roman society that it was often consumed in social settings, regardless of the time of day. For the more casual drinker, diluted wine, watered down to make it go further, was the beverage of choice. This was especially true in the popinae, where patrons could indulge in a cup of wine as they discussed the events of the day or engaged in light-hearted banter. Wine was also a key part of the social scene at banquets, which were a regular feature of Pompeii's elite nightlife. These banquets, held in private homes, were occasions of excess food, wine, and entertainment flowed freely as guests reclined on couches, enjoying the lavish spread laid before them. These gatherings were not just about indulgence, they were also about showcasing one's social status. The host of the banquet would carefully curate the guest list, ensuring that powerful figures, political allies, and prominent citizens were in attendance. The food served at these banquets would have been plentiful and extravagant, often consisting of multiple courses, with delicacies like seafood, roasted meats, and sweet pastries. While these meals were a reflection of wealth, they also served a practical purpose. Banquets were used to form alliances, settle business deals, and reinforce social connections. For the wealthy citizens of Pompeii, these feasts were opportunities to demonstrate their opulence, and the decorations and furnishings in the home played a role in this display. In addition to fine furniture and tapestries, banquet halls often featured murals and sculptures that depicted scenes of gods and goddesses, as well as mythological and historical events. These images not only added beauty to the space, but also conveyed messages about the host's education, taste, and cultural sophistication. To host a banquet in Pompeii was to display one's place within the Roman elite, through the food served, the guests invited, and the art adorning the walls. Of course, no gathering in Pompeii, whether a casual dinner or an extravagant banquet, would be complete without entertainment. Music and poetry were a staple of these events. Musicians often performed while guests dined, playing instruments like the lyre or the flute, setting the tone for the evening. Some feasts included poetry readings, where invited poets would recite works that celebrated Roman achievements or told the tales of gods and heroes. For the citizens of Pompeii, these entertainments were as much a part of the evening as the food and drink itself. Beyond the homes and taverns, Pompeii also offered a variety of more public forms of entertainment. Things like theatrical performances, gladiatorial games, and chariot races, although these were generally reserved for specific times and locations. Theaters in Pompeii were large, open-air structures where plays were regularly performed. These performances could range from light comedies to more serious dramas, and it wasn't unusual for politicians or wealthy citizens to sponsor these events as a way of gaining public favor. The theater in Pompeii, like in many other Roman cities, was a reflection of both entertainment and politics, as well as the Roman appreciation for culture, drama, and spectacle. The amphitheater, perhaps one of the more iconic structures in Pompeii, hosted gladiatorial games where men, often slaves or prisoners of war, fought to the death. While these games may seem brutal by modern standards, they were a central part of Roman culture, providing both entertainment and opportunity for the public to see displays of strength, courage, and violence. The gladiatorial games in Pompeii were usually held during important public festivals or in honor of significant events, and they were an opportunity for the elite to flaunt their wealth by sponsoring such events for the enjoyment of the people. These games were a social and political tool as much as they were entertainment. The public nature of the events ensured that everyone in the city, rich or poor, could enjoy them, as the arena was open to all. The nightlife of Pompeii, then, was an intricate web of social interaction, where politics, culture, entertainment, and indulgence blended seamlessly. Whether it was at the taverns, the banquet halls, the theaters, or the grand public spectacles, Pompeians knew how to unwind. Their nights were filled with laughter, conversation, and a sense of camaraderie, underpinned by the same social structures that governed their daytime lives. In many ways, the nightlife of Pompeii mirrored the city itself, vibrant, diverse, and full of contrasts. Amidst the vibrant streets of Pompeii, with its bustling markets, serene baths, and lively homes, the city was, at the same time, perched on the edge of an inevitable disaster. It is almost as though Pompeii lived in the shadow of its own future, a future that would be determined not by its artistry, commerce, or entertainment, but by the violent force of nature itself. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD remains one of the most catastrophic and historically significant events in ancient history, and while the people of Pompeii likely had little inkling of what was to come, the eruption's effects would freeze the city in time and preserve it for future generations to witness. Mount Vesuvius, which towers over the Bay of Naples, had long been an active volcano. It wasn't the first eruption of the volcano, nor would it be the last, but the eruption of 79 AD would stand out for its ferocity and the sheer scale of its destruction. For centuries, the Roman world had dealt with the occasional tremor or minor eruption, but nothing had prepared the citizens of Pompeii for what was about to happen. By all accounts, the day of the eruption began like any other, a warm summer day with the city bustling with activity. People went about their lives, unaware that the mountain looming in the distance was about to unleash a catastrophe that would change the course of history. The first signs of trouble came in the early morning hours of August 24th, as a rumble shook the ground beneath Pompeii. But these tremors weren't unusual for a city that sat so close to an active volcano. People might have shrugged them off, perhaps assuming they were nothing more than the aftershocks of a minor tremor. However, what followed, soon after, was anything but minor. Over the next few hours, Mount Vesuvius erupted violently, sending a towering cloud of ash, pumice, and smoke high into the sky. This eruption, known as a Plinian eruption, was among the most powerful ever recorded, with ash falling across the city like snow, blanketing everything in a thick layer of volcanic debris. At first, the people of Pompeii might have thought the eruption would be short-lived. After all, the volcano had erupted before and then calmed. But Vesuvius did not settle. Instead, it escalated, sending waves of ash and pumice down upon the city, suffocating the air and filling the streets with darkness. The ash began to fall heavily, at first slowly, and then, in torrents. The streets became choked with the stuff, and it wasn't long before the roofs of buildings began to collapse under the weight of the ash. The air grew thick and suffocating as the people of Pompeii struggled to breathe in the dense cloud of dust and smoke. For those who managed to escape the city, the experience of fleeing Pompeii would have been harrowing. The volcanic ash fell in layers so thick and heavy that it soon became impossible to see. The roads became treacherous, as the ground was buried beneath several feet of debris. The once vibrant city of Pompeii, with its markets, baths, and lively homes, was now a place of chaos and confusion. People scrambled to find shelter, some heading to the nearby coast, hoping to escape by sea. Others, however, were not so fortunate. Many found themselves trapped by the volcanic debris, unable to flee as the eruption intensified. As the day turned to night, the eruption continued relentlessly. The ash cloud grew larger, and the air became even more unbearable. The residents of Pompeii, already struggling to cope with the shock of the eruption, had to contend with an increasingly dangerous environment. Buildings began to collapse under the weight of the ash, and the streets were soon filled with a thick, choking dust that made it nearly impossible to see or breathe. People tried to shelter in their homes, but many were caught off guard, unable to escape the cloud of ash that swallowed the city. Despite the overwhelming odds, there were still those who attempted to flee. Some took refuge in the open spaces outside the city, but others, in desperation, sought safety in the harbor. Boats and ships were quickly filled with those seeking escape, but the eruption had already disrupted the waters, and the port was no longer a safe option for departure. The ash continued to fall, and the heat from the eruption itself created an almost unbearable environment. There were reports of the temperatures in the city soaring, and some of the fleeing residents of Pompeii may have been killed by the heat or the collapsing buildings. The eruption wasn't just an eruption of ash, it was a fiery rain of destruction. The devastation wasn't just confined to Pompeii. The neighboring cities of Herculaneum and Stabia also faced the wrath of Vesuvius. These cities, located to the west of Pompeii, were hit by pyroclastic surges, fast-moving clouds of hot gas, ash, and debris that swept through the cities, burning and burying everything in their path. Herculaneum in particular was almost completely destroyed as the intense heat from the pyroclastic flows left little behind except charred remains. While Pompeii was buried under layers of ash, Herculaneum was consumed by molten rock and ash that baked the city into a tomb of sorts, preserving the buildings and even some of the people who had been trapped in the surge. The destruction of Pompeii, however, did not mark the end of the eruption. Vesuvius continued to erupt for days, spewing ash and pumice into the sky, before finally quieting down. The city of Pompeii lay buried under a thick blanket of volcanic debris, its streets, homes, and public buildings lost to the ages. What followed, however, was something even more remarkable. The eruption, while catastrophic in its immediate effects, also had a unique consequence. It preserved Pompeii in a state of suspended animation. The ash that buried Pompeii acted as a kind of protective shell. It preserved the buildings, the murals, the artifacts, and even the remains of its people, all trapped under layers of volcanic material. When archaeologists began excavating the site, hundreds of years later, they uncovered a city that had been frozen in time, its walls still adorned with colorful frescoes, its streets still lined with shops and homes. The eruption had not erased the city. Instead, it had preserved it in a way that allowed future generations to look back and gain insight into the life and culture of ancient Pompeii. It was as if the city had been gently placed into a deep sleep, awaiting discovery. The tragic story of Pompeii, as frozen as it was in the shadow of Vesuvius, would have been lost to history forever, if not for the determined efforts of those who uncovered its secrets. Centuries later, for nearly 1,700 years, Pompeii lay buried beneath the volcanic debris, a forgotten city. But the eruption of 79 AD would not be the end of Pompeii's story. It would be only the beginning of its rediscovery, and in many ways, its rebirth in the modern world. The first whispers of Pompeii's existence came long after the eruption, during the Middle Ages. The city was hidden under layers of ash, and although people knew of the eruption and its aftermath, the exact location of Pompeii remained a mystery. Over the centuries, local farmers, workers, and even treasure hunters stumbled across fragments of Pompeian art, sculptures, and pottery. Yet, these remains were often treated as curiosities or simply lost beneath the soil once more. It wasn't until the 16th century, during the reign of King Philip II of Spain, that the first serious attempts to locate the city were made. Still, it wasn't until the 18th century that a real archaeological effort began to unearth the lost city. In 1748, the Italian engineer Joaquin del Cubier, working under the command of the King of Naples, began a more systematic excavation of the area around the foot of Vesuvius. He was drawn to reports of ancient statues and marble pillars found in the area. With the blessing of the royal court, excavation work began in earnest. While Cubier's methods were rudimentary by today's standards, his efforts marked the first steps toward the uncovering of Pompeii. Alcubierre's team, digging into the ash layers, began to uncover portions of Pompeii's buildings. The process was slow and often haphazard. Tunnels were dug without much thought for preserving the site, and many valuable artifacts were removed in less than ideal conditions. But even with these less than perfect techniques, what they uncovered was astonishing. Fragments of colorful frescoes, well-preserved mosaics, and even the outlines of human bodies, caught in the final moments of their lives. These early discoveries were groundbreaking, though the full significance of what they had found wasn't immediately apparent to the excavation team. As the years passed, excavation work continued, and by the end of the 18th century, Pompeii had begun to reveal its secrets. But the true scope of the site's historical and archaeological importance would only be fully understood much later. The people of the 18th and 19th centuries were astonished by the remains of the ancient city, but they also struggled to comprehend the city's significance. Many visitors to the site in its early days were more interested in the sensational aspects of the discovery, seeing the preserved bodies and statues than in understanding the larger cultural and historical context. Throughout the 19th century, the excavation of Pompeii began to take shape as a formal archaeological project, with more attention paid to preserving the city and its art. In 1860, Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli became the director of the Pompeii excavations. Fiorelli, who had a background in both archaeology and engineering, introduced a method that would revolutionize how Pompeii was excavated. His team began to carefully dig around the bodies of the victims, pouring plaster into the voids left by decayed remains, thereby creating casts of the people who had perished in the eruption. These casts, sitting or lying, often in contorted postures, gave a haunting glimpse into the last moments of life in Pompeii, a glimpse that would forever change how we viewed the tragedy. Fiorelli's work was groundbreaking, not just for his plaster casts, but also for the systematic way in which he approached the excavation. He catalogued the structures, rooms, and artifacts with unprecedented attention to detail, and his methods helped to establish the framework for modern archaeological excavation. In addition to uncovering more of the city, Fiorelli worked to make the artifacts found at Pompeii available to the public, and he oversaw the creation of a museum to house these treasures. As a result, Pompeii became not just a site for archaeologists, but also a place of interest for the general public, for travelers, and for scholars alike. By the 20th century, the scale of Pompeii's rediscovery had reached new heights. Archaeologists and historians continued to excavate at the site, uncovering even more of the city and learning about its citizens' lives, habits, and daily routines. As more of the city was revealed, Pompeii emerged not just as an archaeological curiosity, but as a window into the past, a fully realized, vibrant Roman city that had once been bustling with life, only to be interrupted by the wrath of Vesuvius. Pompeii's murals, mosaics, statues, and everyday items, pots, bowls, tools, painted a picture of Roman life that was more vivid and complete than anything else we had from that time. The city became a rich resource for understanding the social and economic fabric of Roman society. The architecture revealed not only the sophistication of Roman engineering, but also the intricacies of their domestic lives. Pompeii's residents had lived in an ancient world filled with mythological references, cultural rituals, and complex class structures. Yet they had also lived in a world that felt deeply human. In many ways, the rediscovery of Pompeii brought the past closer to the present than anything else. As the 21st century arrived, Pompeii continued to captivate the imagination. It became a site not for archaeological inquiry, but also for reflection on mortality, on the fleeting nature of life, and on the extraordinary ways in which time can both erase and preserve. People still visit Pompeii today, drawn by the allure of walking through the ancient streets beneath the frescoed walls and over the mosaicked floors, imagining life before the disaster, wondering what it must have been like for those who were caught in the eruption's chaos. The excavation and preservation of Pompeii remain ongoing, as each new discovery offers more insight into this lost world. The haunting plaster casts of Pompeii's final victims, often shown in positions of shock, fear, or resigned calm, are perhaps the most visceral reminder of the eruption's immediate effects. Yet, even as the tragedy of Pompeii's end is etched in stone, ash, and plaster, the city's rediscovery has allowed for a broader understanding of its history, a history that stretches from the chaos of its destruction to the quiet wonder of its preservation. Pompeii's rediscovery was not simply an archaeological victory, it was the opening of a window to the ancient world, a snapshot of Roman life frozen at the very moment of its destruction. The remains of the city have continued to captivate scholars, artists, historians, and the general public for centuries, and its legacy remains as powerful and relevant today as it was when it was first unearthed. The echoes of Pompeii's vibrant streets, its art, its people, and its ultimate fate serve not just as a lesson in history, but as a reflection of the fragility of human life, the impermanence of civilization, and the endless fascination with the past. In the years since the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, Pompeii has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film. The dramatic narrative of a city frozen in time, overwhelmed by disaster, has captured the imagination of many. Writers, poets, and artists from the 18th century onward have used Pompeii as both a symbol of human frailty and as a warning about the unpredictable power of nature. The story of the city has been woven into the fabric of popular culture, with works ranging from scholarly books to adventure novels to Hollywood film. But the most enduring fascination lies not in the tales told about Pompeii, but in the city itself, the murals, the mosaics, the ancient streets, and the quiet ruins that stand as an eternal testament to a moment in time. One of the most striking elements of Pompeii's legacy is its art. The murals and frescoes that adorned the walls of the homes and public buildings are still some of the best preserved examples of Roman artistry. These works are not just decorative, they are windows into the worldview of the people who lived in the city. From the grand mythological scenes in the homes of the wealthy to the simpler depictions of everyday life, Pompeii's murals reveal a society that valued beauty, mythology, and the connection between humans and the gods. These images are as vibrant today as they were nearly 2,000 years ago, with their bright colors and intricate details reminding us that the people of Pompeii were not just ancient figures trapped in the past, but real individuals with hopes, dreams, and passions, much like our own. The artifacts uncovered in Pompeii also provide a tangible connection to the past. The pottery, the tools, the jewelry, and the everyday items that have survived the eruption offer a glimpse into the material culture of the Roman world. These objects, while ordinary in their time, have become extraordinary relics of a lost to civilization. Whether it is the remains of a loaf of bread found in an oven, a basket of figs, or the finely crafted glassware used by the elite, each piece tells a story, and it's not just the objects themselves that speak to us, but the stories they represent. The daily routines, the rituals, the ways people lived and loved, worked and played. These artifacts remind us that despite the vast gulf of time that separates us from the people of Pompeii, we are all part of the same human story. Pompeii has also provided invaluable insights into the social and political structures of ancient Rome. The layout of the city, with its grand public spaces like the Forum, its theatres, and its amphitheatres, reveals much about the role of public life in Roman society. The public baths, the markets, and the streets were places where people from all walks of life came together Whether for business, relaxation, or entertainment, the diversity of the city's inhabitants, merchants, slaves, soldiers, and artists reflects the broad range of social classes that populated the Roman world. Pompeii, in many ways, serves as a microcosm of the Roman Empire itself, a place where class, culture, and commerce intermingled in ways that shaped the identity of the ancient world. Yet, perhaps one of the most compelling aspects of Pompeii's legacy is the human side of the story, the people who lived and died in the city. The plaster casts of victims caught in the eruption's fiery embrace are among the most haunting and poignant relics of Pompeii's past. These casts, molds of the spaces left behind by bodies buried in ash, show the final moments of life in Pompeii. The positions of the bodies, some in the act of shielding themselves, others simply kneeling in a moment of prayer or panic, speak volumes about the fear and helplessness the citizens must have felt as the disaster unfolded. The casts are not just artifacts, they are a window into the personal experiences of the individuals who lived in Pompeii and perished in its destruction. They remind us that beneath the history, the art, and the architecture, there were real people with families, hopes, and aspirations, just like us. As much as Pompeii's ancient cityscape remains a valuable historical resource, it is also a place of contemplation, an invitation to reflect on the fragility of human civilization. The people of Pompeii were no different from us in many ways. They lived with ambition, love, conflict, and celebration, but the eruption of Mount Vesuvius wiped their world away. In an instant, the city, preserved by the volcanic ash, stands as a poignant reminder that civilizations, no matter how grand, can be destroyed in the blink of an eye. The preservation of Pompeii, its art, its streets, and its stories, offers us not only a look into the past, but a reflection on the impermanence of all things. In a way, the city of Pompeii exists as a living memorial, both a celebration of human achievement and a somber meditation on the unpredictable forces of nature. In the centuries since its rediscovery, Pompeii has continued to captivate the world. It remains one of the most visited archaeological sites, drawing millions of tourists each year. The city's ruins, its frescoes, and its artifacts still tell the stories of the lives lived there, of the merchants who haggled in the markets, of the families who dined in their homes, of the soldiers who trained in the arena, and of the gods and myths that shaped their understanding of the world. The legacy of Pompeii is not just one of destruction, but of preservation, a city lost to time, but also one that continues to teach and inspire. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD destroyed Pompeii, but it also preserved it through the ashes, through the centuries, through the excavation. Pompeii remains a testament to the brilliance and vulnerability of ancient Roman civilization, and as long as the ruins of Pompeii stand, they will continue to speak to us, quietly, in the way only ruins can, of a life long gone, but never forgotten. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.